a poor woman, rescued an abandoned child and raised him as her own. Years later, a wealthy family came claiming their son. The full moon peeked through dark clouds, casting a faint glow over the rain-soaked streets of the small village. The rain fell heavily, beating against rooftops and flooding the empty alleys. Clara Martinez, wearing a tattered coat and soaked shoes, hurried toward her modest home at the end of the main street, in the poorest part of town. Her shift at the textile factory had ended hours ago, but the boss had asked her to stay late to finish an urgent order. Exhausted, with her hands still trembling from work, all she wanted was to get home, brew a hot cup of tea, and collapse into her old wooden chair. Yet even in her fatigue, her eyes held the glimmer of unbreakable hope, the spark of someone who had learned to survive against all odds. As she walked through the small village park, a place that used to be filled with children during the day but now looked dark and empty, something made her stop. It was a barely audible sound amidst the storm, a soft, faint cry. Clara stood still, listening with her heart racing. "What? What is that?" she whispered to herself, turning her head from side to side, trying to locate the source of the sound. The crying sounded again, this time a bit louder. Clara felt a chill run through her body. Without hesitation, she stepped into the park, the water soaking her feet even more and the rain hitting her face. She moved cautiously, guided only by that small sob that seemed to call for help. Finally, behind a wooden bench and under the shade of a tree, she found the source of her distress. A small bundle wrapped in a blanket, barely visible in the dark. Clara held her breath as she realized what it was. "Oh my God! It's a baby!" she exclaimed, dropping to her knees before it. With trembling hands, she carefully picked up the tiny package. As she pulled aside the blanket covering it, she saw a tiny, pale face, with cheeks flushed from the cold and eyes tightly shut, in a desperate effort not to cry anymore. The baby looked to be no more than a few months old, and the rain had soaked through its thin clothing. Clara looked around frantically, searching for any hint of who could have left such a small child alone in the storm. But there was no one. The park was empty, and the shadows of the trees loomed like silent giants. Who did this to you?" she whispered, a lump in her throat, pulling the baby close to her chest to give it some warmth. Without thinking about the consequences, Clara removed her coat and wrapped the little one in it, protecting him as best as she could from the rain. The baby stopped crying for a moment and opened his eyes, looking at her with an expression that broke Clara's heart. It was as if the child understood he was safe now. "Don't worry, little one. I will take care of you," she said firmly, feeling a wave of emotions wash over her. "I won't let anything bad happen to you." With the child in her arms, Clara stood up and began to walk quickly toward her home. The water streamed down her cheeks, and she wasn't sure if it was the rain or her own tears. As she moved away from the park, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. But it was dark, and the park lights flickered weakly, as if they too were about to give in. When she reached her small dwelling, Clara pushed the door open with her foot, stepping into her modest, warm home. The house was in disrepair, with old, worn furniture she had collected over time. There was barely any food in the pantry, and the stove didn't work well, but it was all she had. Her hands shook as she made her way to the small sofa and gently laid the baby on a blanket she quickly spread out. The child looked at her with wide, curious eyes, as if he were trying to understand who this woman was that held him so tenderly. Clara dried him off with an old towel and wrapped him in a warmer blanket, all the while murmuring soothing words. "It's all right now, little one. It's all right," she repeated, stroking his little head tenderly. Amid her confusion and fear, Clara began to search the small blanket in which she had found the child, hoping to find some clue. It was then she noticed something that made her gasp. In one corner of the blanket, stitched with golden threads, was an elegant and intricate symbol, a coat of arms. "What is this?" she murmured, tracing the design with her fingertips. The quality of the blanket and the intricate design were signs of wealth. This did not belong to someone poor or desperate. What was a child doing with something so expensive, abandoned in a dark and lonely park? The mystery baffled her, but what worried her more was what she should do now. I can't turn you over to the authorities," she said aloud, as if trying to convince herself. "If I do, they might return you to whoever abandoned you." The baby yawned, stretching his tiny hands toward her, as if choosing her. Clara felt her heart race, and in that moment, she made a decision that would change her life forever. "You will stay with me, little one. I don't know who you are or where you come from, but now you are my son. I'll call you Thomas." On that rainy night, Clara, a solitary and poor woman, became a mother. And though deep down she knew this would bring trouble, she couldn't let him go. The love she felt when she looked at that child was stronger than any fear. With that promise, Clara knelt beside the baby and under the dim light of an old lamp, kissed him on the forehead. "Thomas, you will never be alone. I will always be here for you." The sun was barely rising on the horizon when Clara awoke. The birds were singing softly, heralding the start of a new day, but her mind was still wrapped in the turmoil of the previous night. Everything felt like a dream, as if that storm, the park, and the baby's cries had been mere figments of her imagination. But when she turned her head, there he was, wrapped in a blanket on the sofa, a small, fragile being sleeping peacefully. The sight moved and terrified her at once. It was real. The child was real. "Good morning, little one," she whispered, a mix of tenderness and nervousness filling her voice. The baby slowly opened his eyes and began to wiggle his tiny hands. Clara felt a pang of love and concern. He was so defenseless, so pure, and now depended entirely on her. Everything that happened to this child was in her hands. She knelt beside him and smiled, though her thoughts raced about what she should do. "You need a name," she said aloud, stroking the baby's tiny hand. "I can't keep calling you little one." She thought for a moment. She remembered a name she had always wanted for a child, a name she had cherished in her dreams during the years she tried to start a family. Something simple, yet strong. "Thomas. I will call you Thomas." The name slipped out softly, and as she said it, Clara felt something settle inside her. The baby seemed to respond, waving his little hands in the air and babbling. Clara laughed softly, surprised at how this unknown creature could already evoke so much in her. The first challenge arrived quickly. Clara realized she had no food for a baby. Her pantry barely held dry bread and a few cans. With her limited funds and no access to proper nourishment for a newborn, she felt overwhelmed by the responsibility she had just taken on. Determined, she left her house with Thomas wrapped in the blanket, seeking help from her friend Rosa, who lived a few streets away. Rosa, a robust and energetic woman, welcomed her with a mix of astonishment and concern. "Clara, what are you doing with—" Rosa was left speechless upon seeing the baby in her arms. "Where did this child come from?" "I found him last night, abandoned in the park. I couldn't leave him there," Clara explained in a trembling voice, looking at her friend with pleading eyes. "I need help, Rosa. I don't have food for him or proper clothes." Rosa looked at her incredulously, trying to process what she was hearing. But in her eyes, there was a flicker of understanding and support. She had known Clara her entire life. She understood how much she longed to be a mother and how much pain she had endured from not being able to have children. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly, already knowing the answer. Clara nodded firmly. "I don't know if this is right, but I can't turn him in. I feel like he needs to be with me." With a sigh, Rosa invited her in and offered her a bowl of milk and a few things she had prepared for her own child, who was already older. As Clara fed the baby, Rosa watched her closely. "If you're going to keep him, You need more than this. You need diapers, clothes, a safe place for him to sleep, Rosa said, mentally listing everything a baby would need. I know, Clara admitted, feeling overwhelmed by the list of necessities. But I'll do whatever it takes. I'll find a way. When Clara left Rosa's house with Thomas in her arms, rumors had already begun to circulate in the village. Some neighbors looked at her with skepticism, others with curiosity. Whispers rose as she passed, and she could feel the weight of judging gazes upon her. Have you heard? An elderly woman whispered to her neighbor. Clara has shown up with a baby. Where did she get that child? They say she found him in the park, but who knows? She can barely take care of herself, the other murmured, shaking her head in disapproval. Despite the criticisms, some were kind. The owner of the local store offered her some baby food at a discounted price, and the baker gave her a couple of fresh rolls when she stopped by to say hello. But others, like Mr. Ortega, the butcher, were less understanding. What do you think you're doing with that child, Clara? He confronted her harshly as she entered his shop. How do you plan to take care of him? You don't even have a stable job. That child needs more than love. Clara felt the shame and anger burning inside her, but she held her gaze steady. I may not have much, she replied with dignity, but I'll give him everything I have. He'll receive more love from me than he could anywhere else. The butcher scoffed, but didn't press further. Clara left the shop with her head held high, but inside she trembled. Was it true what they said? Was she condemning that child to a life of poverty and hardship? But looking at Thomas, who gazed back at her with his big, curious eyes, she knew she couldn't give up. Back at home, Clara devoted herself to organizing the small corner where she had decided Thomas would sleep. She transformed an old basket into an improvised crib, laying down soft blankets and a pillow she had used as a child. She spent the rest of the afternoon ensuring that the baby was comfortable and warm. As night fell, Clara held him in her arms, softly singing an old lullaby her mother had sung to her so many years ago. Sleep, little one, for the moon is watching over you, she hummed, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her. Thomas snuggled against her, relaxing to Clara's voice. The love she felt in that moment surprised her. It was something so deep and pure it almost hurt. I promise you'll never go without, she murmured, kissing his forehead. I'll do whatever it takes to make you happy. Outside, shadows lengthened, and the village fell into deep silence. But inside that small house, a new life began to bloom. Clara, a humble and solitary woman, had finally found a reason to keep fighting, to keep dreaming. And although she didn't know it at that moment, fate was already writing the next chapters of her life. What seemed like a simple act of kindness would change everything forever. With Thomas asleep in her arms, Clara closed her eyes and for the first time in a long time, felt whole. Winter arrived early that year, covering the small village with an unyielding blanket of cold. Temperatures plummeted and the need pressed harder than ever. Clara did everything she could to keep Thomas warm and well fed, but the challenges of raising a baby with so few resources grew heavier. Each day's routine became increasingly complicated. Clara had to stretch every penny, improvise with what little she had, and sometimes even go hungry to ensure that Thomas was taken care of. The textile factory didn't pay enough, and sleepless nights left her drained for the long workdays ahead. Yet, no matter how tired she felt, every time she saw Thomas's smiling face when he woke up in the morning, she felt all her efforts were worthwhile. One morning, after nearly 2 weeks without a single day of rest, Clara found herself needing to speak to her supervisor at the factory. Mrs. Jimenez, I need an advance, she said, approaching with restless hands and a racing heart. It's just for this month. My son is sick and... The woman, with a stern face and no sign of compassion, didn't even look up from the notebook where she was jotting down notes. Advance? Do you have any idea how many people are in the same situation as you? She replied coldly. There's no extra money. If you can't work your full shift, I'll replace you with someone who can. Clara felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. She had counted on that money to buy food for Thomas and a thicker blanket. But she didn't give up. She knew begging wasn't her style, but for Thomas, she was willing to do it. "Please, I'll work overtime. I'll work weekends. Whatever it takes," she insisted, her voice cracking at the end. The supervisor stared at her for a long moment and then, with an annoyed sigh, shook her head. "Fine, Martinez. I'll give you an advance, but don't expect any more favors in the future." Clara breathed a sigh of relief and nodded, feeling a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. "Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to me." With the small advance in hand, Clara rushed to the market, buying some milk, bread, and a few vegetables. That night, when Thomas looked at her with those big brown eyes and smiled with the purity of a child, Clara felt that every sacrifice had been worth it. But not everyone thought the same way. News about the baby Clara had chosen to raise alone spread quickly throughout the village, like fire in dry grass. Some looked at her with admiration and called her brave. Others, more numerous, labeled her foolish. "It doesn't make any sense," Mr. Ortega, the butcher, commented while cutting a piece of meat for a customer. "She can barely pay her own rent. How is she going to raise a child?" "She's deceiving herself," added the neighbor from the third floor, an elderly woman with a wrinkled face and a stern expression. "She should take him to social services. He'd be better off somewhere where they can provide for his needs." These words swirled in Clara's mind every time she stepped outside. The murmurs and disapproving looks followed her everywhere. But the community was not unanimous. There were those who saw in her a devoted mother, someone who had dared to take a step that few would have the courage to take. "What you need is help, not criticism," Rosa said one day when she visited her in her small apartment. Rosa had brought a package with some used clothes and a few bottles that her son no longer needed. Clara looked at her with gratitude, feeling that, at least, she wasn't completely alone. "You don't know how much I appreciate it, Rosa. But I can't keep asking for things. I want to show that I can take care of him," Clara murmured, hugging Thomas tightly. "It's not asking if we're friends," Rosa replied firmly. "You have to understand that you're not alone in this. Thomas has more people who care about him." Rosa glanced at Thomas, who smiled innocently, unaware of the troubles surrounding him. Clara nodded, feeling for the first time in days that a weight was lifting from her chest. One afternoon, while Clara walked with Thomas through the town square, an unexpected event occurred. The baby, who was now stronger and beginning to babble, did something that filled his mother with joy. He uttered his first word. "Ma, Ma!" he exclaimed, stretching his little arms toward her. Clara stopped abruptly, looking at her son with wide eyes. Tears began to well up in her eyes, and unable to contain herself, she knelt before him, caressing his cheeks with trembling hands. "What did you say, little one?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Mama," Thomas repeated, smiling with that purity only children possess. Clara's heart filled with an indescribable warmth. In that moment, all the sleepless nights, worries, and hardships faded away. She had been recognized as a mother. He saw her as the protective and loving figure she had always dreamed of being. "Yes, little one." "Mommy is here," she said, hugging him tightly, as if fearing someone might snatch that moment away. Around them, a few people paused to watch the scene. A couple of women exchanged smiles, moved. A pair of elderly folks sitting on a nearby bench nodded approvingly. Even Mr. Ortega, the butcher, who happened to be passing by, looked at her with an expression that could have been a hint of respect. But not everyone shared Clara's joy. From the opposite corner, a shadowy figure observed the scene with a frown. Don Ernesto, the elderly man who had supported Clara from the beginning, had noticed that man's presence several times over the past weeks, and something in his gut told him he wasn't there by coincidence. "That luxury car. I've seen it before," he muttered to himself, watching the sleek black vehicle parked on the corner. "Something isn't right." But he didn't want to alarm Clara. Not yet. That night, when Clara returned home with Thomas, she felt an inexplicable chill as she opened the door. She looked around nervously and shut the door harder than usual, making sure the lock was secure. "Don't be silly, Clara," she scolded herself. "Everything is fine." But as she rocked Thomas to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, as if the mere fact that Thomas had called her Mom had triggered something in the universe. "Nothing and no one will take you from my side," she whispered, kissing his forehead as the child closed his eyes. "I promise you that." However, while Clara curled up next to Thomas on the small sofa, she was unaware that just a few streets away, a man was pulling a photo from his pocket. The image showed a dark-haired baby with large eyes, wrapped in a blanket with a golden emblem. "We've finally found you," he murmured, with a satisfied smile. The past Clara had tried to bury was about to come to light, and with it, troubles would emerge that would test not only her love, but also her strength as a mother. The morning sun filtered through the tattered curtains of Clara's small house, filling the room with a warm, golden light. The old wooden table, scarred and worn by time, bore witness to countless modest dinners and impromptu school lessons. The sofa, where Clara and Thomas used to snuggle, now seemed tiny compared to the rapidly growing child. Thomas was now 10 years old. He was no longer a helpless baby, but an agile, energetic boy. His dark hair fell in tousled strands across his forehead, and his large eyes sparkled with curiosity and intelligence. He always had a smile on his lips and a question at the tip of his tongue. Though Clara still called him "my little one," Thomas was no longer so small. "Mom, look at this," Thomas exclaimed, running toward the kitchen with a piece of paper in hand. "It's a drawing of our home." Clara turned from the stove, where she was stirring a pot of soup that barely contained some vegetables and a bit of chicken. Thomas's smile made her momentarily forget the struggles they still faced. She took the drawing and examined it closely. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said sincerely. "You drew the house, and look, even our invisible puppy," she added with a soft laugh, pointing at a small doodle next to the house. Thomas laughed too, but his eyes, always so expressive, filled with an unexpected seriousness. "Mom," he murmured, scratching his head. "Did we ever have a real dog?" Clara felt a pang in her heart. She knew that Thomas's questions about his life and origins had been increasing in recent months. Until now, she had managed to deflect his doubts with stories about a past that wasn't entirely true, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Thomas was growing up, and with him, his desire to understand his own story. "No, sweetheart," she finally said, gently stroking his hair. "We never had a dog, but that doesn't mean we can't have one in the future." Thomas nodded slowly, but his gaze remained fixed on her. "And my dad?" he suddenly asked, dropping the question like a stone into a tranquil lake. Clara froze, feeling her entire body tense. She had dreaded this moment since she decided to stay with Thomas. She knew he would eventually want to know more about his father, about who he was and where he came from. But what she didn't expect was to feel so much pain upon hearing him ask. "Thomas," she began, searching for the right words, "your dad isn't with us anymore." The boy looked at her with wide eyes. "Is he dead?" he asked innocently, unaware of the weight of his own words. No, Clara rushed to say. "It's complicated." She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "There are things that you might not understand right now, but I promise that when you're a bit older, I'll tell you everything I can." The answer didn't seem to satisfy Thomas, but he nodded slowly, still looking at her with those eyes that seemed to see through every lie, every evasion. "It's okay, Mom." His voice was soft, but in it lay a silent promise. He wouldn't stop asking questions. That very day, Clara took Thomas to the town school, as she did every morning. It was a small, somewhat dilapidated building with peeling walls and windows clouded by moisture. But for Thomas, that place was a paradise of discoveries and play with his friends. Upon arrival, he saw Pablo, who was waiting for her with a smile at the entrance. Pablo, with his leather jacket and ever-warm expression, had become a pillar in Clara's life. Despite their differences and ups and downs, he kept showing up, always ready to help. "Good morning, Clara," he said, bending down to greet Thomas with an affectionate gesture. "How's it going, champ?" "Hi, Pablo," Thomas responded enthusiastically, showing off his drawing. "Look what I made. It's our house, and our invisible puppy." Pablo laughed heartily. "Wow, you've got talent, kid. Maybe one day you'll make me a portrait." Then he looked at Clara seriously, though he kept smiling. "Is everything all right?" Clara nodded, although fatigue reflected in her eyes. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just—" She glanced at Thomas, who was already running toward the entrance. "He's starting to ask questions." Pablo observed her in silence for a few seconds and then placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sooner or later, that was going to happen, Clara, but you don't have to face it alone." Clara sighed, grateful for his presence. Pablo had been her unconditional support, always on the periphery of her life, offering help without pressure. But Clara knew he wanted more, that he wanted to be part of her life in a way she hadn't allowed until now. "I know, Pablo. But it's not that easy." Pablo nodded, not taking his eyes off her. "Nothing worth having is." His words hung in the air as Clara watched Thomas disappear into the building. Every day, he resembled more of a little man, filled with strength and determination, and each day, the fear of losing him grew within her. That afternoon, when Thomas came back from school, he brought something that shook Clara deeply. Upon arriving home, he approached his mother with a serious expression and a glint of excitement in his eyes. "Mom, I found something," he said, opening his backpack and pulling out a small, worn cardboard box. Clara felt a chill run down her spine at the sight of the box. She recognized it instantly. It was the same one where she had kept the blanket and the brooch the night she found Thomas. But how had it come into his hands? She had hidden it well, under a pile of old clothes. Where did you find that?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "In the closet," Thomas said, gently opening the box. "Mom, whose is this?" He held the small blanket in his hands. "It's so pretty and soft. It doesn't look like anything we have here." Clara knelt before him, gazing at the golden brooch resting in the box. The emblem shimmered faintly, reminding her of the night she found it and all the unanswered questions she had kept in her heart. "Thomas, listen," she started, but the words caught in her throat. Thomas looked at her intently, his eyes reflecting a mix of confusion and determination. "Is it mine, Mum?" he asked quietly. "Is this from when I was a baby?" Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her secrets becoming unbearable. But then she nodded slowly. "Yes, sweetheart. This is yours. I kept it safe because I wanted to protect you. But I promise I'll tell you everything I know soon." Thomas stared at her silently for several long seconds, and then unexpectedly smiled. "It's okay, Mum. I know you always take care of me." He threw himself into her arms, hugging her tightly. "I love you." Clara squeezed him against her chest, feeling time stand still. But deep in her soul, she knew the clock had already started ticking, and the past she had dreaded was closer than she thought. Something was coming, something that would change their lives forever. The wind howled fiercely, sweeping dry leaves along the dusty streets of the small town. Clara couldn't shake the image of Thomas holding the box with the blanket and the brooch from her mind. The child's curiosity had awakened something she had kept hidden for so long, the truth about his origins. A truth she didn't fully understand herself, but was terrified to uncover. With Thomas at school, Clara decided to do something she had postponed for 10 long years. She put on a thick coat and headed to Don Ernesto's house, the only man who had mentioned anything about the night she found Thomas. Ernesto was a kind, elderly man who had been like a father to her, but he also held more secrets than he let on. The door of Ernesto's house creaked as it opened. The old man was sitting by the window, wrapped in a blanket, gazing outside with his tired but still lively eyes. "Clara," he said with a smile when he saw her enter. "What brings you here so early, my daughter?" Clara approached, feeling the knot in her stomach tighten with each step. She sat before him, unable to take her eyes off him. "Don Ernesto, I need you to tell me the truth." Her voice was soft but firm. "About Thomas. About what you saw that night in the park." The old man blinked, as if the words had taken him by surprise. Then he sighed and looked down at the floor, a somber expression crossing his face. "I knew that sooner or later you'd ask me this question," he murmured, straightening slowly. "But listen carefully, Clara. There are things better left unknown." "No," Clara exclaimed, shaking her head. "I can't keep living like this, in fear. Thomas has started asking questions and Her voice broke. "I don't know what to tell him. I need answers." Ernesto remained silent for a long moment, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the window. Finally, he slowly rose, leaning on his cane, and moved toward a small wooden box on a dusty shelf. He pulled out a yellowed envelope and handed it to Clara with trembling hands. "This is all I have." Clara took the envelope, feeling her heart race. "The night you found Thomas, I saw a black car parked near the park. It was a luxury model, not something you see often around here, but it wasn't the car that caught my attention." "What was it then?" Clara asked, her heart in her throat. Ernesto looked at her intently. "It was the shield on the license plate and the emblem on the hood." He pointed to the envelope Clara was holding. "That emblem." Clara opened the envelope with trembling fingers and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed a sleek black car with a golden emblem on the license plate, the same design that was on the brooch she had found with Thomas. "That car," Clara murmured. "Whose was it?" Don Ernesto sighed and sat down again, his eyes filled with deep sorrow. "It belonged to the Ramirez family, Clara, one of the wealthiest and most influential families in the region. I don't know what they were doing here that night, but if they're connected to Thomas..." The old man looked at her gravely. "It means Thomas wasn't abandoned. He was left here deliberately." Clara felt the world sway around her. The Ramirez, a renowned family, full of power and influence. Why would they leave a baby in a small park in a humble town like hers? "What do you mean?" she whispered, feeling breathless. "That Thomas could be someone important to them," Ernesto replied sadly. "And if they find out where he is, they won't stand by idly." The silence that followed was oppressive, like a weight falling onto her shoulders. "You have to be prepared, Clara." Clara stood up from the chair, her mind racing. She thanked Don Ernesto and quickly bid him farewell, clutching the envelope tightly against her chest. She had no time to lose. If the Ramirez were involved, she needed to know why, and above all, what that meant for Thomas. Back at home, she sat at the kitchen table and spread out the photograph of the car. The golden emblem gleamed faintly under the lamp's light. She felt that each time she looked at the design, something inside her broke a little more. Who was Thomas really? And why had they left him in such an inhospitable place? "It doesn't matter who they are," she told herself out loud. "Thomas is my son. I've raised him, I've loved him, and I won't let anyone take him away from me." With renewed determination, Clara decided to take the first step in discovering the truth. She headed to the town center, where the small local library was run by an elderly woman named Doña Carmen, who was known for knowing everything that happened in the area. "I need to research something," Clara said firmly as she entered the library. Doña Carmen looked at her with curiosity, setting aside her book. "What are you looking for?" "Information about the Ramirez family. Everything you have." The intensity in Clara's gaze left Doña Carmen speechless. The woman nodded slowly and walked toward a dusty corner of the library where she kept old files and newspapers dating back many years. Clara began to search eagerly, running her hands over the yellowed pages, stopping at every article mentioning the family. What she found left her stunned. The Ramirez family had a complicated history. Alejandro Ramirez, the current head of the family, had inherited the fortune after the mysterious disappearance of his youngest son 10 years ago. According to the articles, the baby had vanished during a stay at one of their properties in a nearby region, and the family had never stopped searching for him. The lost son of the Ramirez. "It can't be," Clara murmured, feeling a knot in her stomach. "Is Thomas that child?" The article described how the family had offered a large reward and had used all their power to find him, but to no avail. For years, the case had gone cold, and eventually the child's name was forgotten, just like the tragedy surrounding the family. "What does this mean?" she asked quietly, feeling terror crawl down her spine. If Thomas was the lost child of the Ramirez, then everything she had built could come crashing down at any moment. The question was, why had they left him in the park that night? And what would happen if they discovered him now? Clara left the library feeling the world closing in around her. The Ramirez were not just any family. They were powerful, relentless. If Thomas was truly the child they had lost, they wouldn't stop at anything to get him back. But she wasn't going to give up. Thomas was her son. It didn't matter where he came from or what blood ran in his veins. She had raised him, given him love when no one else did. And if anyone tried to take him away, they would fight with everything she had. Because a mother doesn't give up. Never. With the photograph of the car in one hand and the truth beating in her chest like a drum, Clara knew the battle was just beginning. The afternoon was sinking into a leaden grey, the sky threatening storm, and the air was thick with humidity and tension. Clara walked quickly through the deserted streets of the small town, her head full of thoughts that wouldn't stop swirling. She knew she had to be strong, but the information she had uncovered about the Ramirez family had left her stunned. There was no doubt. Thomas was the child they had lost 10 years ago. And if that family discovered he was still alive, a struggle would ensue in which Clara, a simple, humble woman, would have everything to lose. Arriving at her house, she stopped in front of the door, taking a deep breath to calm herself before entering. Thomas couldn't perceive her anguish, not now. Even though her entire world was shaking, she had to be the strong, loving mother he had always known. She opened the door with a forced smile and found Thomas sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers and colored pencils. "Mom, look what I did," he exclaimed, lifting a drawing where Clara and he were holding hands, surrounded by a garden of flowers. Clara's heart tightened at her son's innocence. How could she explain that her life was about to change in ways he wouldn't understand? She knelt beside him and hugged him tightly, surprising Thomas. "I love you, little one. No matter what happens, never forget that, okay?" Thomas pulled back a bit and looked at her with those large eyes full of curiosity. "Is something wrong, Mum? Are you sad?" Clara shook her head, striving to keep her expression calm. "No, sweetheart. I just wanted you to know." She kissed him on the forehead and let him continue drawing while she headed to the kitchen. But while preparing dinner, her mind kept racing. She couldn't just sit and wait for the Ramirez to find her. She had to be ready to protect Thomas. But how? She needed money for a lawyer, a contingency plan. Something. And the reality was that she had nothing. The next day, Clara arrived at the textile factory with a frown and a heavy heart. She had worked there for years, enduring long hours and mistreatment just to keep a steady income. But that morning, the supervisor called her into his office. "Clara, I need to talk to you," he said in a stern voice. The supervisor, a short, stocky man with a thin mustache, looked at her with a mix of pity and coldness. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, feeling a bad premonition. "There have been staff cutbacks," he said bluntly. "Unfortunately, we can't afford to keep everyone. You won't be needed here from today." The words hit her like a punch in the stomach. She felt her blood run cold. "What? But," she tried to say, her voice barely a whisper, "I need this job. I have a son who depends on me. Please, Mr. Ramirez." The supervisor shrugged. "I'm sorry, Clara, but the decisions have already been made. You can come by to collect your things and your last check." Clara left the office with trembling hands. The check they gave her would barely cover the rent for the month. How was she going to support Thomas? And now what would she do to defend him from the powerful family that would surely come looking for him? Returning home that afternoon, Clara felt despair choking her. There was no one to ask for help. No one except Pablo. That same night, Clara called Pablo, who arrived at her house in a matter of minutes. When he opened the door and saw her expression, he knew something was terribly wrong. "Clara, what's going on?" he asked with concern, closing the door behind him. I lost my job," she said in a dull voice. "I don't know what to do. Everything is falling apart and I can't protect Thomas alone." Pablo looked at her in silence for a long moment, then slowly approached her, taking her hands. "Clara, let me help you." His words were soft but filled with determination. "You don't have to go through this alone. You know how much I care about you, how much I care about Thomas. I can cover the expenses, get you a lawyer if needed." Clara felt tears welling in her eyes. She had always rejected Pablo's help, proud of her independence and determined to prove she could do it on her own. But now it wasn't just about her. It was about Thomas. "I can't ask you for that, Pablo," she whispered. "It's not fair to you." "I don't care about what's fair," he replied firmly. "What matters is that you're okay, that Thomas is safe." He looked her in the eyes, and Clara saw the sincerity of unbreakable love in his gaze. "Let me take care of them, Clara. I'm not asking for anything in return." Silence stretched between them, only interrupted by the sound of the wind beating against the windows. Clara knew that accepting would mean giving up her independence, that determination she had maintained all these years. But the reality was cruel. She needed help, and Pablo was the only one who could offer it. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "Okay, Pablo," she whispered. "I'll accept your help, but only until I can stand on my own." Pablo smiled with relief and, without thinking, wrapped her in his warm, protective embrace. "Thank you, Clara. I won't let you down." The following days passed in a tense balance. With Pablo's help, Clara began looking for ways to secure a future for Thomas. But fate would not give them a break. One morning, while Thomas was playing in the schoolyard, a black car stopped in front of the entrance. Clara, who was collecting some documents in the principal's office, felt a chill run down her spine. When she stepped outside, she saw the vehicle and instantly knew something was wrong. "Who is it?" she asked the secretary, but the woman merely shrugged. With her heart pounding, Clara ran toward the car just as a well-dressed man, clad in an expensive suit, stepped out and surveyed his surroundings with an arrogant air. Their eyes met for a brief second, and she knew he had recognized her. "Who are you?" Clara demanded, stepping in front of him to block his path. The man smiled coldly. "I'm Roberto Ramirez, and I'm here to take what's mine." Clara's world crumbled. Despite her efforts to protect Thomas, the Ramirez family had found her, and they weren't going to stop until they took the child she had raised as her own. "I won't let you take him," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with rage and fear. Roberto looked at her with disdain, as if she were an annoying insect. "You can't do anything to stop it. He doesn't belong to you." Clara felt her body tremble with every word. But she didn't move. She wouldn't allow anyone, not even a family as powerful as the Ramirez, to take her child away from her. "Thomas is mine," she murmured firmly, standing her ground. "I've raised him. I've loved him. I won't let you take him." Roberto looked at her for another moment and then smiled, a cold and dangerous smile. "We'll see about that, Mrs. Martinez." He leaned closer, whispering with a tone full of threat. "This is just the beginning." And with those words, he turned around and returned to the car, leaving Clara trembling with rage and terror in the schoolyard. Time was running out. The Ramirez had taken their first step, but Clara was not willing to lose her son without fighting with everything she had, because a mother's love knows no bounds, and she was prepared to go to the end. The days following Roberto Ramirez's appearance passed in a dense, confusing haze for Clara. Her mind was consumed by anxiety, fear, and uncertainty. She woke up each morning with the feeling that everything was about to collapse, and every time she looked at Thomas, she felt time slipping away from her grasp. She had waited years for this moment, a moment she had always feared but never knew how to face. Now that the powerful Ramirez family was on Thomas's trail, every decision and every second mattered. Clara didn't know who to turn to. Should she try to hide? Should she contact a lawyer? But with what money? Still, Pablo, true to his promise, hadn't left her alone. He had become her rock, helping her plan and keeping her calm when she felt she was falling apart. But despite his support, Clara knew she was facing an unequal battle, and the first round had just begun. It was a Saturday morning, the sun shining in the sky, and the air was filled with the vibrant energy of the town on market day. Clara and Thomas walked through the busy streets, buying some fresh fruits and vegetables, trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy. Thomas, always curious, darted from stall to stall, marveling at the colors and smells of the market. "Mom, look!" he exclaimed, pointing to a candy stall. "Can we buy one?" Clara smiled and, despite the difficulties, pulled out a couple of coins and handed them to him. Seeing the joy in her son's eyes was a balm for her soul. "Pick the one you like best, sweetheart." Thomas ran toward the stall, and Clara seized the moment to relax a bit. She watched her son talk to the vendor, gesturing with excitement, and couldn't help but feel proud. He had grown so much, all thanks to her effort and sacrifice. But her brief respite was suddenly interrupted. "Clara Martinez," a cold, authoritative voice said beside her. Clara turned her head sharply, feeling her stomach tighten. There, standing in the crowd, was Alejandro Ramirez, Thomas's biological father. He was wearing an impeccable suit, and his demeanor exuded power and determination. Beside him stood two burly men, clearly bodyguards, watching Clara with impassive expressions. "Mr. Ramirez," she murmured, instinctively stepping back. "We're not doing this in a crowded market," he said, ignoring her greeting and looking disdainfully around. "Come with me. We need to talk." Clara felt anger and fear battling within her, but she gritted her teeth and shook her head. "I have nothing to discuss with you." She tried to keep her voice steady, even though inside she trembled like a leaf. Alejandro frowned, a flicker of impatience showing in his gaze. "Don't make this harder than it already is." He leaned in toward her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "That child is my son, and I'm going to get him back, no matter the cost." "No," Clara said in a low voice but filled with strength. "Thomas is mine. I've raised him for 10 years. I've cared for him. I've loved him. You have no right to take him away." Alejandro straightened, jaw clenched tight. "That's not a decision you can make, Clara. This will be resolved in court. And trust me, my wife and I will do everything in our power to ensure that child returns to his rightful home." "That is his rightful home," Clara shot back fiercely, pointing toward Thomas, who was still chatting with the candy vendor, oblivious to everything. "And do you really think you can take better care of him than we can?" Alejandro scoffed, a cold smile on his face. You don't even have a stable job. You can barely pay the rent. What kind of future can you offer him? Alejandro's words were like daggers, piercing through each of her insecurities and fears. But Clara didn't let rage consume her. She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. I may not have money or luxuries, but I've given him love, and he loves me. Her eyes filled with restrained tears. I won't let you take him away. Alejandro looked at her with a mixture of pity and arrogance. I suggest you reconsider your position. It will be easier for everyone if you cooperate. He gestured to one of his bodyguards, who handed him a white envelope. Here's enough money to cover your expenses for a while. Use it to start anew. And if you have any common sense, let's end this here. Clara looked at the envelope with disdain, as if it were pure poison. I don't want your money, she snapped, her voice trembling with indignation. I'm not selling my son. Alejandro studied her for a moment, then shook his head in disappointment. Fine, I warned you, Clara. He turned halfway and began to walk away, his bodyguards following closely. But remember my words. This is just the beginning. Clara stood there, her heart racing furiously. She knew Alejandro meant it. The Ramirez wouldn't back down, and she didn't have the resources or power to face them head-on. But as she saw Thomas running toward her with a big smile, holding a candy in his hand, she knew there was no other option. Look, Mom, he said, showing her the sweet with pride. Can I eat it now? Clara knelt down, wrapping her arms around Thomas, feeling tears silently sliding down her cheeks. Yes, sweetheart. Of course you can. Thomas looked at her curiously. Are you okay, Mom? Clara nodded, forcing a smile. I'm fine, little one, I'm fine. But she wasn't, because she knew the clock was ticking and the time she had with her son was running out. 2 weeks after the confrontation at the market, the official notification arrived. The Ramirez family had initiated legal proceedings for custody of Thomas. Clara read the letter with trembling hands. It was addressed to Clara Martinez and explained, with an impersonal coldness, that the Ramirez family sought to reclaim their lost son, claiming they had been victims of kidnapping and that Thomas legally belonged to them. That night, when Thomas went to bed, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the paper before her. Her hands were empty. She had no money for a lawyer, no proof that she was the best option for Thomas, but she had something the Ramirez did not. She had the unconditional love of her son, and that had to be enough. It had to be. Thomas deserved a bright future, and even if she couldn't offer him luxuries, Clara would give him the best fight of her life. She stood up from the chair with renewed determination and walked to Thomas's bedroom. She leaned over his bed and kissed his forehead, whispering softly, I won't let them take you, little one. Not while I'm still standing. And with that promise, Clara decided she would fight, with every ounce of strength she had, for the only family she had ever known and loved. The past had returned to reclaim what had once been theirs, but Clara wouldn't let them take it away. Not without fighting until her last breath. The early hours of the day the trial was set to begin passed in tense silence. Clara stood in front of the mirror in her tiny bathroom, trying to calm her nerves. She had pulled her hair into a simple bun and wore the only formal blouse she owned, one she had gotten years ago for a job interview that never panned out. She looked tired, more than usual, with deep circles under her eyes and a slight tremor in her hands that she tried to hide. From the small kitchen, Thomas watched her with his big, curious eyes. Why are you so nervous, Mom? He asked innocently, sitting at the table with a cup of milk that he had barely touched. Clara forced herself to smile and walked over to him, crouching down to meet his gaze. Today, she swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. Today we're going to talk to some important people who will decide something about you, sweetheart. Thomas frowned, clearly confused. What will they decide? Is it something bad? Clara felt her heart break at the worry in his face. She reached out and gently stroked his hair. "No, my love, nothing bad," she murmured, wishing that were true. "I just want you to remember that I love you no matter what happens, and that we will always be together, okay?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment and then nodded, a bit unsure. "I love you too, Mum." Clara hugged him tightly, feeling tears threatening to spill, but she held them back. Today was the first day of the trial, and she couldn't afford to lose her composure. Not now that the Ramirez were determined to fight with everything they had. The clock struck 8. It was time to face her greatest fear. The courtroom was packed. Clara entered hand in hand with Thomas, feeling all eyes on them. The murmur of the crowd quieted as Alejandro and Camila Ramirez made their entrance, followed by their legal team. Alejandro held his chin high and wore a confident expression, while Camila, with a haggard face and glassy eyes, barely glanced at Clara. Behind them, Lucia, the Ramirez's eldest daughter, followed silently, her gaze lost on the floor. The tension in the room was palpable. Clara held Thomas closer to her, feeling the warmth of his small body as an anchor to keep her steady. The judge, an older man with a stern face named Fernando Santoro, entered the courtroom and gently tapped his gavel against the table, calling for order. Clara forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "We are here to determine the custody of the minor, Thomas Ramirez," the judge declared in a grave voice. "The plaintiffs, the Ramirez family, allege that the child was kidnapped 10 years ago and has been raised in an inadequate environment. The defendant, Mrs. Clara Martinez, maintains that she has been his mother and caregiver all this time, and that the child considers Mrs. Martinez his only family. Let's proceed with the statements." The Ramirez's lawyer, a man in a dark suit with a sharp expression, immediately rose. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Alejandro Ramirez, is here to reclaim his lost son. This case should not be difficult to resolve. My client has DNA proof confirming that Thomas is his biological child, as well as the financial resources and family environment that guarantee a stable and prosperous future for the boy." "Money isn't everything," Clara interrupted, feeling her anger rising. "Thomas is happy with me. I have been his mother all this time. They left him in the park. They abandoned him." The lawyer frowned and shook his head with a condescending smile. "That is something yet to be determined, Mrs. Martinez. I remind you that you are not the biological mother of the child, but someone who has illegally retained him all these years." The words hit her like a hammer. Illegally. Clara felt the ground sway beneath her feet, but before she could respond, the judge raised a hand. "Order in the court. We will proceed with the testimonies of the involved parties." The judge looked first at the Ramirez. "Mr. Alejandro Ramirez, you may speak." Alejandro rose slowly, addressing the stand. His presence was imposing, and when he began to speak, he did so with a calm and controlled voice. "Your Honor, my wife and I have suffered a devastating loss over these 10 years. We lost our son, and our family was shattered. We never stopped searching for him. We never lost hope. And now that we have found him, we only want to give him the home he deserves." "Why did you stop searching?" Clara interrupted, her voice trembling with indignation. "If you cared so much, why didn't you come back to the town? Why didn't you ask? He has been here all this time." The judge looked at her sternly. "Mrs. Martinez, you will have your chance to speak. Please remain calm." Clara bit her lip, feeling tears threatening to spill, but she nodded. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," Alejandro continued, unbothered by the interruption. "I understand that Mrs. Martinez has taken care of Thomas during these years, but he is not her son. He belongs to his real family, and we are willing to do whatever it takes to reintegrate him into his true home." Clara felt her heart shatter with each word. She looked at Camila, hoping to see a hint of doubt on her face, but the woman continued to avoid her gaze. Something didn't add up. Why wasn't she fighting harder? Why did she seem so defeated? Finally, the judge turned to Clara. Mrs. Martinez, it's your turn. Clara stood up, her legs trembling slightly. She took a deep breath and looked the judge directly in the eyes. The words caught in her throat, but she forced herself to continue. I have raised Thomas for 10 years. I was there when he took his first steps, when he said his first word. I was there when he had a fever and was scared in the dark. She looked at the Ramirez, feeling tears finally sliding down her cheeks. You weren't there. You didn't care for him. And if you left him in that park, then do you really deserve to be called his parents? The judge narrowed his eyes, contemplating her words. Do you have any evidence that Thomas was abandoned and not kidnapped? Clara opened her mouth to respond, but stopped. The truth was, she had no evidence. All she had were memories of that night and the photograph Don Ernesto had given her, the photograph of the luxury car that belonged to the Ramirez. No, I have no proof, she admitted, her voice broken. But I know I didn't kidnap him. I found him. I just wanted to give him a chance to be happy. Alejandro rose again, his eyes shining with a dangerous intensity. But you kidnapped him, he shouted loudly, addressing the judge. She kept him away from us. The judge raised a hand to stop the discussion, but before he could say anything, another voice rose in the courtroom. That's not true. Everyone turned. The voice belonged to Camila Ramirez. She had stood up, and for the first time since the trial began, she looked directly at Clara. What he says is not true, Camila repeated, her voice trembling. The entire room held its breath. What are you saying? Murmured Alejandro, his face pale. You know perfectly well that Thomas was not kidnapped. The words came out rushed but clear. You know that. It was your brother Roberto who left him there. It was he who made him disappear. Silence fell over the room. Alejandro stood frozen, eyes wide open, unable to utter a word. No, he finally yelled. That's a lie! But the damage was already done. Camila turned to the judge with tears in her eyes. I couldn't bear the thought of losing my child, but I can't lie anymore. She took a deep breath, her lips trembling. My brother-in-law, Roberto, did it to eliminate Thomas from the line of succession. He thought that if Thomas disappeared, Alejandro would be the sole heir. She turned to Clara with an expression of pain and regret. She is not a kidnapper, Your Honor. She saved my son. The judge tapped his gavel softly. We will need to investigate this new statement, he said firmly. For today, the session is adjourned. But as the crowd began to murmur and Alejandro yelled in fury, Clara could only look at Camila, feeling that, for the first time, maybe, just maybe, she had a chance to win. The hours following the trial were a whirlwind of emotions and chaos. Camila's confession had left everyone stunned, and news spread like wildfire throughout the small town and beyond. Clara couldn't believe what she had heard. On one hand, the revelation that Roberto, Alejandro's brother, had been responsible for Thomas's disappearance gave her some hope, but it also raised new questions and a deeper fear. How would the trial unfold after that confession? How much danger was Thomas in now? Alejandro had reacted with fury, denying everything Camila had said, but the damage was done. The truth was out in the open, and the case was now far more complicated than anyone had imagined. That same night, as Clara and Thomas walked home in the rain, her thoughts swirled restlessly. The little boy walked silently beside her, head down and shoulders hunched. He had been so quiet all day, watching the trial, the fights, and the arguments, and Clara could see something inside him had changed. As they arrived at their small home, Clara paused at the threshold, observing her son's pale face. It hurt to see him so confused and scared. "Thomas, sweetheart," she said softly, kneeling in front of him. "Are you okay?" The boy looked at her with those big dark eyes that had always been her anchor, But this time there was something different in them, a glimmer of doubt. "Mom," he whispered, "is what they said today true?" Clara felt a knot form in her throat. She knew exactly what he was referring to. "What do you mean, my love?" Thomas looked down, nervously fiddling with the hem of his sweater. "Are they my family?" His words were barely a whisper, but they hit Clara with the force of a storm. "Are they my real family?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara closed her eyes, trying to contain the pain those words caused her. She had dreaded this moment for years, but facing it now was much harder than she had imagined. "Darling, listen," she began, her voice trembling. They are your biological parents, yes, but that doesn't change anything between us." She tried to keep her voice steady. "I have been your mother all these years. I've cared for you. I've loved you." Thomas looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "So, why did they leave me?" he asked, his voice cracking at the end. "Why did they abandon me?" Clara felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. She wanted to scream, to tell him that he hadn't been abandoned, that he had been left there as part of a cruel and ruthless plot. But she couldn't make him carry that truth. Not yet. "I don't know why it happened, my love," she finally said, gently stroking his cheek. "But I know it was a mistake. And I have tried to give you everything I could since then." Thomas looked away, tears sliding down his cheeks. "But they're rich, aren't they?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "They have money, big houses. And I don't want you to keep going hungry or working so hard just so I can have food." His words shook her. Was that what he thought? That she was suffering because of him? Clara felt panic swirling inside her. "No, Thomas," she exclaimed, gripping his shoulders. "Never think that. I don't care if we're poor. I don't care if I have nothing. You are the only thing that matters. Everything I've done, because I love you. You are my son. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me." But Thomas didn't respond. Instead, he gently pulled away from her grasp and turned away, his shoulders hunched. "I need to be alone," he said softly, walking towards his small room and closing the door behind him. Clara stood there, in the middle of the living room, feeling like her world was crumbling. What was happening? Was she losing Thomas? And if she was, how could she stop it? That very night, after making sure Thomas was asleep, Clara left the house to meet Pablo. He had insisted on accompanying her to the trial, but she had forbidden him, fearing things would get even more complicated. However, now she needed to talk to someone. She needed to vent all the pain and confusion she felt. They met in the small town square, under the dim light of a flickering street lamp. Pablo looked at her with concern the moment he saw her approach. "Clara," he whispered, stepping closer and taking her hands in his. "What happened?" The tears she had been holding back all day finally flowed. She crumpled in his arms, shaking violently. "I'm losing him, Pablo," she sobbed. "I'm losing him. Thomas doesn't know what to do. He's so confused. They're putting ideas in his head, and I don't know how to fight that." Pablo held her tightly, stroking her back with slow, comforting movements. "Shh. Calm down, Clara. You're not losing him. Thomas loves you. He's just confused, that's all." "But he—" Clara looked up, her eyes filled with desperation. "He thinks he'd be better off with them, that I can't give him what he needs." Pablo looked at her with deep sadness. "That's not true. Thomas needs the love that only you can give him. No mansion or luxury in the world can replace that. But," he hesitated for a moment, "maybe you need to give him space. Don't force him to choose right now." Clara shook her head, feeling even more lost. "How am I supposed to give him space when they're trying to take him from me? What do I do if he decides to go with them?" Then you'll have to be strong and show him that you will always be here, no matter what." Pablo held her by the shoulders, looking her firmly in the eyes. "You can't force him to stay, Clara. But you can make sure he knows that no matter where he goes, he will always have a place to return to." Pablo's words hit her hard. It was true. She couldn't force Thomas to stay, but she could make him understand that her love didn't depend on where he was, that even if he chose to go with the Ramirez family, she would always be his mother. Do you think that will be enough?" she asked, her voice broken. Pablo smiled sadly and nodded. "Love is always enough, Clara." She stayed silent for a long moment and then hugged Pablo tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what I would do without you." Pablo kissed her gently on the forehead, and in that moment, Clara felt that despite all the chaos, she had someone to lean on. Yet the fear still wouldn't leave her, because the trial was just beginning, and the Ramirez wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. The next morning, Clara woke up with a new determination. She knew what she had to do. With her heart racing, she went to Thomas's room and sat down beside him on the bed. "Darling," she began softly, stroking his hair, "we need to talk." Thomas looked at her with a sleepy expression, but he nodded slowly. "I know this is all very confusing for you, and I know you think you might be better off with them." Clara took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears. "But I want you to know that, no matter what happens, you will always be my son. And if you ever decide to go with them, I won't stop you." Thomas looked at her with wide eyes. "Really?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Yes," she said, swallowing the lump in her throat, "because I love you, and all I want is for you to be happy." Thomas stayed silent for a long moment. Then he threw himself into his mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "I don't want to leave, Mom," he shouted, clinging to her. "I don't want to go." Clara hugged him with all her strength, tears rolling down her cheeks. "It's okay, darling. You don't have to. I would never ask you to." As they embraced, Clara knew this was just a small victory, but it was a step in the right direction. Thomas loved her, and that, at least for now, was enough. But the trial was still not over, and the Ramirez wouldn't give up so easily. The day of the trial arrived with an atmosphere charged with tension and expectation. Clara sat in her assigned seat, squeezing her hands in her lap to keep her nerves from showing too much. Pablo was by her side, his solid and comforting presence as always. Thomas sat between them, his head down and his face serious, a devastating contrast to the joyful boy he used to be. Judge Santoro, a man with penetrating eyes and a stern expression, entered the room with firm steps. The murmurs from the audience immediately hushed, and silence fell like an oppressive blanket. All eyes turned to him as he took his seat and reviewed the documents in front of him. "We are here to determine the legal custody of minor Thomas Ramirez," he announced in a grave voice, looking at each party present. "This court has been informed of new developments in the case involving allegations of kidnapping and abandonment by the Ramirez family. We will hear statements from the parties and witnesses before making a final decision." Clara felt a knot in her stomach. She knew Camilla's confession had shaken everything, but she also knew Alejandro wouldn't give up easily. She had seen the hatred and determination in his eyes. For him, Thomas was not just his son. He was a symbol of power, control, something that had to be reclaimed at all costs. The Ramirez's lawyer, an elegant man with graying hair and a sharp gaze, stood up. "Your Honor, we request that the court grant full and immediate custody to my clients, Mr. and Mrs. Ramirez." He paused, shooting a cold glance at Clara. "Not only because they are the child's biological parents, but also because Mrs. Martinez is unfit to provide him with an adequate home." "That's not true," Clara shouted, standing up from her seat, but the judge raised his hand, signaling her to remain silent. "Mrs. Martinez, you will have your turn to speak," he said firmly. "Please maintain your composure." Clara nodded and sat back down, feeling her legs tremble. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. "Proceed, Mr. Blanco," the judge said to the Ramirez's lawyer. The lawyer nodded and turned to the court with a triumphant expression. "Mrs. Martinez, according to evidence we will present, lives in conditions that are clearly unsuitable for a child. She has unstable financial records, lacks a steady job, and depends on others for survival." He turned to Clara with a chilling smile. How could someone like that properly care for a minor? Clara felt her blood boil. They had investigated every aspect of her life, bringing to light every little failure, every moment of hardship, and now they were using it against her. But she wouldn't give in. She wouldn't let them take her son just because she didn't have money or because she had gone through hard times. "That has nothing to do with the love I've given him," she replied firmly. "I've worked day and night to ensure that Thomas is well. He has never lacked food, shelter, or affection." The judge nodded slowly, taking notes. "That is something we will evaluate," he said. "But before proceeding, we need to hear statements from witnesses. Mr. Ramirez, do you have witnesses who can corroborate your version?" Alejandro stood with a cold, controlled expression. "Yes, Your Honor. I would like to call my wife, Camila Ramirez, to the stand." Clara held her breath. Since Camila had confessed the truth in the previous session, she hadn't seen or spoken to her. Would she still support her, or would Alejandro's pressure make her retract? Camila slowly stood, her gaze lost and her face pale. She walked with unsteady steps to the stand and sat down, not looking directly at anyone. Alejandro's lawyer approached her and watched her closely. "Mrs. Ramirez," he said in a soft but firm voice, "can you explain to us what really happened 10 years ago?" Camila took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment before speaking. "My brother-in-law, Roberto," she began with a trembling voice. He hated Thomas. He thought that if Thomas disappeared, Alejandro would be the only heir." She opened her eyes, tears shimmering in them. "One night, he took advantage of the fact that we weren't home and took him away. I didn't know what had happened. Only when it was too late did I discover the truth." The lawyer frowned. "And didn't you do anything to get him back? Didn't you call the police?" Camila looked down, ashamed. "Alejandro convinced me that it would be better not to make a scene. He said that it would be better to keep it quiet, to avoid damaging the family's reputation." Clara looked at Alejandro with hatred. It had all been planned. He knew it all along, and yet he had put her through this hell. But she didn't understand why. Why fight so hard to get Thomas back now? Alejandro's lawyer changed tactics. "But you are his biological mother, Mrs. Ramirez. Do you want to get your son back?" Camila looked up and glanced at Clara, her face filled with pain. "I want Thomas to be happy, and I believe that Clara has been a good mother to him." Alejandro shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Camila continued. "She has loved him when I couldn't. She has been there for him all these years. I can't take that away from her." The silence that followed was thick. The lawyer closed his eyes for a moment, frustrated, and then turned to the judge. "No more questions, Your Honor." Judge Santoro nodded and looked at Clara. "Mrs. Martinez, do you wish to call any witnesses?" Clara slowly stood, feeling insecure. She had few allies, but there was one person whose voice could make a difference. "I would like to call Don Ernesto to the stand." Don Ernesto, the elderly man who had been like a father to her, stood up with effort and slowly walked to the stand. He sat down and looked at the judge with clear, wise eyes. "Don Ernesto," Clara began, feeling a lump in her throat, "can you tell the court what you saw the night I found Thomas?" The old man nodded slowly. "I saw a black car, A car I recognized immediately. It belonged to the Ramirez family. I saw it stop in the park, and shortly after, someone got out with a bundle in their arms. He looked at Alejandro with disdain. I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined they would leave a baby there, as if he were garbage. Clara felt tears welling in her eyes. Don Ernesto had been with her from the beginning, and now he was there, defending her when she needed it the most. "And you?" Clara's voice trembled. "Do you believe I kidnapped Thomas?" Don Ernesto looked at her with tenderness. "No, my child. You rescued him, and you gave him the home they never offered." The judge nodded, taking notes with a furrowed brow. "Thank you, Don Ernesto. You may step down." Clara turned to the judge, her heart in her throat. "Your Honor," she said with a shaky voice, "Thomas is my son. I may not have brought him into the world, but I have given him everything I have." Tears rolled freely down her face. "I just want him to be happy." The judge looked at her in silence for a long moment. "We will evaluate all the evidence before making a decision. The session is adjourned until tomorrow." As she stood and left the room, Clara felt hope and fear intertwining within her. The trial was not over, but she had achieved something important today. Thomas was her son, and she wouldn't stop fighting, because a mother never gives up. And this battle was still far from over. The morning of the second day of the trial dawned with a thick fog covering the town like a shroud of uncertainty. Clara woke with her heart racing and her mind occupied with what the day would bring. Despite the difficult moments from the previous day, there was a glimmer of hope. Camilla's confession and Don Ernesto's testimony had opened a door, but many doubts remained, along with an unyielding enemy to face, Roberto Ramirez. After quickly preparing herself, Clara headed to the courthouse with Thomas and Pablo. The boy seemed calmer today, but his face still reflected the confusion and fear he felt being caught in the middle of this battle. Clara took his hand and crouched down in front of him before entering. "Remember, no matter what happens, we'll always be together, Thomas," she whispered, looking into those dark eyes she loved so much. "Don't let anything they say make you doubt how much I love you." Thomas nodded slowly, squeezing his mother's hand. "I know, Mom." His voice was low but firm. "I love you." Those words filled Clara with strength. Together they crossed the courthouse doors, preparing for the new confrontation. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense. Everyone present felt something important was about to be revealed. Alejandro sat with his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on Clara with palpable hatred. Camilla, beside him, kept her gaze down, as if the internal battle she was waging was tearing her apart inside. "Your Honor," began Alejandro's lawyer, standing up. "My client requests that Mr. Roberto Ramirez take the stand to clarify the allegations made against him." Clara felt her breath hitch. Roberto, the man who, according to Camilla, had planned everything, the true perpetrator of Thomas's disappearance. She had seen him in photographs, but never in person. What would he do? Would he deny everything or remain silent? The side door of the courtroom opened, and Roberto Ramirez entered with an expression of absolute calm on his face. He was a tall man with graying hair and a piercing gaze. He moved with the confidence of someone used to controlling every situation he found himself in. Without even looking at Alejandro, he walked to the stand and took his seat, intertwining his hands on the table in front of him. "Mr. Ramirez," began the lawyer with a clear voice, "you have been accused of having kidnapped your nephew 10 years ago and of having abandoned him deliberately. What do you have to say in your defense?" Roberto smiled, a cold, calculated gesture. "The accusations from my sister-in-law are unfounded and absurd," he said smoothly. "I have no reason to have done something so cruel. My family has always been the most important thing to me." Clara felt a wave of rage. How could he lie so easily? How could he say that his family was important when he had tried to destroy hers? But before she could react, The judge intervened. Mr. Ramirez, Mrs. Camila Ramirez has testified under oath that you were responsible for the child's disappearance. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Roberto shrugged, a look of pity on his face. My sister-in-law is clearly confused, Your Honor. She has been under a lot of stress, and her emotional state has been unstable for years. He looked at Camila with false concern. I have always been here to support my brother and his family. I have nothing to do with this situation. Clara clenched her fists. So, he planned to blame Camila, labeling her unstable. Did he intend to use her own insecurities against her? But then, something happened that no one expected. That's a lie, a female voice shouted from the back of the room. Everyone turned to the door, where a tall, elegant young woman with brown hair pulled back in a braid confidently made her way through the crowd. You can't keep lying, Roberto. Enough! Alejandro jumped up, his eyes filled with surprise and fury. Lucia! What are you doing? Clara also stood up, her heart racing. The Ramirez family's eldest daughter, Lucia, walked firmly to the stand, facing her uncle with a look filled with hatred and pain. I can't stay silent anymore, Dad, she said, her voice trembling but determined. Roberto told me. He confessed years ago. A murmur of astonishment rippled through the room. Clara felt her whole body tremble. Was Lucia on the side of the truth? What are you talking about, Lucia? Alejandro growled, his voice resonating with danger. You're confused. I'm not confused, Lucia replied firmly. Roberto came to our house when I was 13. He told me that Thomas was no longer a problem, that I shouldn't worry because he had taken care of everything. She looked at the judge, tears in her eyes. I didn't understand at the time what it meant, but now I know he was talking about my brother. The judge tapped the gavel, demanding silence. Miss Ramirez, can you confirm that your uncle specifically told you he had eliminated your brother from the family? Lucia nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. He said it in those words. And She looked at Clara with a mix of pain and regret. I didn't do anything because I was afraid of losing my family. Clara gasped. This was the proof they needed. Lucia was corroborating what Camila had said. But would it be enough? Roberto shot up suddenly, his face red with rage. "You're lying, brat," he roared, pointing an accusing finger at his niece. "You don't know what you're talking about." But the judge raised a hand, stopping him with a severe look. "That's enough, Mr. Ramirez," he said firmly. "In light of these new statements, I order a formal investigation into your involvement in the disappearance of Thomas Ramirez. Until then, this trial is suspended." A burst of murmurs filled the room. Clara felt her legs go weak. Had they won? Was this the end? "This isn't over," Roberto shouted, turning to Alejandro. "You knew what I was doing. Don't blame me alone." Alejandro paled, but didn't respond. The judge struck the gavel again. "Guards, please escort Mr. Roberto Ramirez out of the room." The guards approached and took Roberto by the arms, but before they could take him away, he turned to Clara with a malevolent smile. "Enjoy this small victory, peasant," he spat venomously. "Because my brother won't give up. Thomas belongs to him." Clara felt a chill run down her spine, but before she could respond, Roberto was escorted out of the room, leaving behind a trail of tension and fear. The judge turned to Alejandro, his gaze stern. "Mr. Ramirez, this trial will resume when the investigation has concluded. Until then, Thomas will remain in the temporary custody of Mrs. Martinez." Alejandro slumped in his seat, pale and dazed. Clara felt a slight relief. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. With her heart racing, she leaned toward Thomas and hugged him tightly. "I promised you I wouldn't let you go, and I won't, little one," she whispered, feeling the relief and fear intertwining within her. "No matter what comes next, I will always be here for you." But deep down in her mind, she knew that Alejandro wouldn't sit idly by. The Ramirez family didn't give up easily, and now, with Roberto out of the picture, Alejandro was more determined than ever to reclaim what he believed was his. Clara braced herself for what was to come, because this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the true battle. The day after the trial suspension, the entire town seemed aware of what had happened. Rumors spread like wildfire. The looks directed at Clara were a mix of curiosity and sympathy, while those aimed at Alejandro Ramirez were laden with distrust and contempt. Lucia's confession had dealt a devastating blow to the Ramirez family's spotless image, but Clara knew that didn't mean the battle was won. The court had granted her temporary custody of Thomas, but that small victory was barely a breather. The judge had made it clear that the decision could change once the investigation into Roberto concluded. Still, Clara wouldn't allow herself to let her guard down, knowing that Alejandro would not rest. That suspicion was confirmed a few days later when Alejandro showed up at her door. It was a cold, rainy afternoon when someone knocked on Clara's door. She was in the kitchen preparing dinner for Thomas when the knock resonated through the house. Opening the door, she found herself face to face with Alejandro Ramirez. His imposing figure and haggard face were cloaked in the shadow of his hooded coat, from which raindrops dripped. "What are you doing here?" Clara asked, feeling a mix of anger and fear. Alejandro looked up, his eyes shining with an almost sickly intensity. "I need to talk to you, Clara. I didn't come here to argue. I just want to have a conversation." Clara fell silent. Everything inside her screamed to shut the door and stay away from this man, but at the same time, curiosity and the need to protect Thomas kept her rooted in place. "Thomas is sleeping," she murmured. "I don't want you to wake him." Alejandro nodded slowly, as if his presence at the door of such a modest home was the most natural thing in the world. "I know. I didn't come to wake him. I came to offer you a deal, something that could change your life." Clara felt the air grow heavier around her. "A deal?" she echoed, looking at him with suspicion. Alejandro took a deep breath and reached into the inner pocket of his coat, pulling out a thick envelope. He held it out to Clara, but she didn't take it. "Inside this envelope is an offer that will allow you to start anew, far away from here, away from all this pain and conflict." Clara looked at him with a mix of disbelief and anger. "What are you talking about?" Alejandro pressed his lips together and opened the envelope, pulling out a check that he held in front of her eyes. The numbers written on it seemed unreal to Clara. 6 figures in cash. $700,000, Clara, Alejandro said slowly, each word heavy with weight. "That's what I'm willing to give you if you agree to leave and relinquish custody of Thomas." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Clara couldn't take her eyes off that check. $700,000. That amount was more than she could earn in a lifetime of hard work. She could buy a house, secure an education for Thomas, ensure his future. She wouldn't have to worry about food or rent again. She could free herself from the constant struggle to survive. "That's," she murmured, feeling the words get stuck in her throat. "It's a lot of money." Alejandro nodded, keeping his gaze fixed on her. "Yes, enough for you to start fresh anywhere. You could leave all this behind and have the life you've always wanted." He leaned in slightly, his voice low and persuasive. "All you have to do is leave. Let Thomas stay with us. He will be fine." Alejandro flashed a twisted smile. "He could attend the best schools, live in safety and luxury. He will never lack for anything." Clara felt her heart race. Alejandro's words echoed in her mind. $700,000. With that, she could do so much for Thomas. But then she looked at him again and saw the true nature behind his offer. It wasn't about sacrifice for Thomas's well-being. It was about control, power, proving that he could buy anyone, even the woman who had raised his child with love. "Do you really think you can buy me?" she finally asked, her voice dripping with disdain. Alejandro frowned, but forced himself to remain calm. "It's not about buying you, Clara. It's about giving you a dignified way out." He shook the check slightly. "Think about it. You could leave without a problem, without having to keep fighting. All this could end right now." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of temptation. With that money, Thomas could have a bright future. She could secure him a comfortable life, something she could never provide. But then she thought about all the sleepless nights, every smile, every laugh, every word they had shared. He was her son. She had raised him. They had built a life together, and no amount of money in the world could change that. She opened her eyes and slowly shook her head. "No." Alejandro blinked, as if he hadn't understood. "What?" "I don't want your money," Clara said, her voice firm and resolute. "Thomas is not an object to be bought and sold. He's my son, and I'm not leaving him, no matter how much you offer." Alejandro's expression darkened. The control and calm he had maintained until now evaporated, replaced by growing fury. "Clara," he said through clenched teeth, taking a step closer to her, "you don't know what you're rejecting. This is your last chance to get out of this situation with something. If you don't take it, I'll make sure you're left with nothing. Do you understand?" But Clara didn't back down. "I'd rather have nothing than sell my son." Alejandro looked at her with eyes blazing with rage, his breathing heavy. For a moment, Clara thought he would hit her. His fists were clenched, and his lips trembled with contained fury. "You're an idiot," he spat, raising his voice. "You have nothing. You are nothing. Thomas will be better off without you." Clara felt fear creep down her spine, but she stood firm. "I may have nothing," she said quietly, "but I have my son, and I won't give him up." Alejandro stared at her for a long moment, his expression twisted with rage and frustration. Then, with a swift motion, he tore the check into pieces and threw them on the floor. "Very well, Clara," he murmured, his voice laced with venom. "If that's what you want, then be prepared. I'm going to ruin you. You won't keep Thomas. I won't let you win." He turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door with such force that the walls shook. Clara stood there, trembling, feeling tears welling in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. It wasn't about the money. It never was. Alejandro didn't understand what it meant to be a parent. He didn't know what it meant to love someone unconditionally, and she would stand firm, no matter what he tried. That night, Clara sat beside Thomas's bed, watching him sleep. He looked so small, so innocent. But she knew this conflict couldn't be hidden from him forever. Sooner or later, Thomas would have to face the truth. "Mama," he murmured, slowly opening his eyes. "Everything's fine, sweetheart." She gently stroked his hair. "Everything's fine." Thomas looked at her seriously. What did he want? Clara swallowed hard. How could she explain what Alejandro had tried to do? "He wanted to make me an offer," she finally said, her voice trembling. "But I didn't accept it." "Why not?" he asked, curiosity sparkling in his eyes. Clara smiled and leaned down to kiss him on the forehead. "Because nothing in the world is worth more than you, Thomas." She hugged him tightly. "I will never leave you." Thomas looked at her with those big dark eyes and nodded slowly, snuggling against her. "I don't want to go either, Mama." And at that moment, Clara knew she had made the right decision. No matter what Alejandro tried, she would keep fighting, because she was priceless, because a mother's love can't be bought or sold, and because Thomas was everything to her. In the days following Alejandro's furious visit, time passed like an unsettling calm before the storm. Clara sensed something was about to happen. Alejandro had made it clear he wouldn't give up, and despite his apparent defeat, there was something in his gaze that continued to unsettle her, like a predator lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. She knew she had to stay alert, but physical and emotional exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. One morning, while preparing breakfast for Thomas, she received an unexpected call. The neutral, professional tone of the voice on the other end made her stop in her tracks. "Mrs. Clara Martinez, I'm Paul Anderson, the investigator assigned to the Ramirez case. I need to speak with you in person. There are some things we need to discuss." Clara felt her heart sink. What would an investigator want with the Ramirez family? Doubts and fears swirled in her mind, but she agreed to meet him at the small cafe in town near the central square. "I'll be there in an hour," she said, her voice tense before hanging up. She looked at Thomas, who was still drawing at the kitchen table, oblivious to everything happening around him. With a heavy heart, she decided not to alarm him. "Sweetheart, I need to step out for a moment. I'm going to meet someone. I'll be back soon, okay?" She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Pablo will come to stay with you." Thomas nodded distractedly, absorbed in his drawing. Clara left the house, feeling that each step brought her closer to an abyss. The small cafe was nearly empty when Clara arrived. The rain had kept most locals indoors, and the atmosphere was grey and cold. Sitting at a table by the window, Clara waited with a churning stomach. She didn't have to wait long. A tall, thin man with glasses and carefully styled dark hair entered and walked straight toward her. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Paul Anderson." Clara shook his hand cautiously and watched as he sat down across from her. He carried a black briefcase that he placed on the table delicately, as if it contained something extremely fragile. "Thank you for coming," he said with a forced smile. "I want to be direct. I have information that could help you in the trial, or destroy you. It all depends on how you want to handle this." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The man in front of her was not just an ordinary investigator. There was something calculating and meticulous in his gaze, something that told her this meeting was not merely a coincidence. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. Anderson pulled out some documents from the briefcase and handed them to her. Clara took them with trembling hands and began to read. Her vision blurred as she comprehended what she was seeing. They were detailed reports about her finances, her bank transactions, and her work history. Every late payment, every rejected loan, every bounced check. It was all there, meticulously documented. What does this mean?" she stammered, feeling anger and fear intertwining in her chest. Anderson looked at her with a neutral expression, as if evaluating her reaction. "It means that if the judge sees this, it could be used against you. The court could consider you unable to provide the necessary economic stability for a child. You could lose Thomas in a matter of days." Clara felt her world crumble around her. Her entire financial past, every mistake and hardship she had faced, was now being wielded as a weapon to destroy her. She looked up at Anderson, her heart pounding with fury. "What do you want?" she whispered. "I want to offer you an alternative." Anderson leaned forward, a conspiratorial expression on his face. "Work with me. Let me help you find something that will completely discredit the Ramirez family. If we can prove that Alejandro is involved in Roberto's manipulations, that he knew about his own son's disappearance from the start, the case could take a complete turn in your favor." Clara felt hope briefly resurge, but something about Anderson's proposal didn't sit right. Why would someone from the Ramirez investigation team help her destroy them? There was something off. "Why would you help me?" she asked suspiciously. Anderson smiled slightly and leaned back in his chair. "I have my reasons. Let's just say that not everyone in the Ramirez family deserves to come out of this unscathed. There are secrets even Alejandro doesn't know, and I can help you find them." Clara's heart raced. She knew she should distrust this man, but she also knew that any advantage could be crucial in this battle. She took a deep breath and looked him straight in the eyes. "What kind of secrets?" Anderson pulled an envelope from the inner pocket of his jacket and handed it to her. "Start with this. It's a document from a family trust. Pay close attention to the date and the name of the beneficiary." Clara opened the envelope with trembling hands and read the document. Her eyes widened as she reached the last line. Thomas Ramirez, she whispered, feeling a knot form in her throat. But this is from 12 years ago. Why? Because Alejandro wanted to keep Thomas as a secret card. Anderson watched her with cold, calculating eyes. He knew that Roberto wanted to get rid of the child, but instead of stopping it, he let it happen to have something to manipulate his brother with. That's monstrous, Clara murmured, unable to believe what she was hearing. That's how things are played in the Ramirez family, Mrs. Martinez. Nothing is what it seems. Anderson stood up slowly. Think about it. If you really want to save Thomas, you'll have to get your hands dirty. But be careful. Alejandro is not an opponent who will be easily defeated. And why should I trust you? Clara asked warily. Because now our goals align. Anderson flashed a hollow smile. Because I want to see how that family destroys itself. Call me when you're ready to fight for real. With those words, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving her alone with the documents in hand and a mix of fear, anger, and confusion throbbing in her chest. When she returned home, she found Pablo sitting in the living room with Thomas. They both looked at her with concern upon seeing her expression, but Clara said nothing. She simply kissed Thomas and asked him to go upstairs to his room. I want to talk to Pablo alone, sweetheart. I'll be back in a moment, okay? Thomas nodded, casting one last questioning glance before disappearing up the stairs. What happened? Pablo asked, frowning as he approached Clara. Clara dropped the documents on the table, her body still trembling. The Ramirez are worse than we thought, she whispered. Alejandro knew from the beginning what Roberto was planning. He let it happen because he wanted to use Thomas as a pawn in his power game. Pablo looked at her in disbelief. That's insane. Clara nodded, feeling desperation swell within her. Yes, but now I know the truth. She lifted her gaze, determination burning in her eyes. And I'm going to use it to protect Thomas. Pablo took her hands, his eyes filled with concern and affection. Clara, this is dangerous. Alejandro won't stop at anything. I know. She looked at him seriously. But neither will I, because this is my son, and I won't let him have his way. Pablo sighed and nodded slowly. Then I'm with you, no matter what happens. Clara felt a comforting warmth in her chest hearing those words. She was not alone. She didn't have to face this alone. And with the truth on her side, she prepared to take the next step, because the fight for Thomas was about to end. The morning of the final day of trial dawned with a grey sky and a tense atmosphere. The courtroom was packed with people, journalists and onlookers who had gathered to witness the outcome of one of the most controversial and dramatic cases the small town had seen in years. They all whispered among themselves, their eyes fixed on the two sides that were about to face off for the last time, Clara and the Ramirez family. Clara sat next to Pablo in the witness stand. Beside her, Thomas sat quietly, his nervous eyes scanning the room. Clara's hand gently squeezed her son's, trying to convey the calm she herself didn't feel. The final verdict would be issued today. Everything would be decided in the coming hours. Alejandro was on the opposite side of the room, his expression rigid as a stone mask. Although he had maintained his composure for most of the trial, Clara had noticed how tension and frustration had built up within him. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, now sparkled with a dangerous fire. Order in the court, Judge Santoro announced, banging the gavel on the table. The murmurs ceased immediately, and everyone present fell silent, expectant. The judge sat up straight in his chair, looking at both parties with a savory expression. Today we have reached the climax of this case. He looked at Clara first, then at Alejandro, before directing his attention to the child. Thomas Ramirez, who for the past 10 years has lived under the care of Mrs. Clara Martinez, faces a difficult decision that will affect the rest of his life. Clara swallowed hard, feeling the weight of each word. The judge paused and then continued. After reviewing all the evidence presented and hearing testimonies, including contradictory statements and the revelation of Roberto Ramirez's involvement in the child's disappearance, I have made a decision that I believe is in the best interest of the minor. Clara squeezed Thomas's hand tighter, and Pablo placed a hand on her shoulder to offer support. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The judge took a deep breath and looked directly at Thomas, softening his expression slightly. Thomas, I want you to know that this is not your fault. None of what has happened is because of you. You are a strong and brave child, and you deserve to have the best possible life. With that in mind, his eyes shifted to Clara. The court has decided to grant full and permanent custody to Mrs. Clara Martinez. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara felt all the air leave her lungs. She had won. Had she really won? She could hardly believe it. Relief and joy intertwined within her as she looked at Thomas, who was staring at her with wide eyes, as if unsure he had understood correctly. "Does that mean I can stay with you?" Thomas asked in a whisper. Clara nodded, tears welling in her eyes as she hugged him tightly. "Yes, my love." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but this time they were of pure happiness. "You're staying with me. Forever." But as Clara and Thomas embraced, Alejandro abruptly stood up from his seat. The expression on his face was one of absolute disbelief, quickly followed by overflowing hatred. "This is a farce," he shouted, his voice resonating with fury in the room. "He can't do this. That boy belongs to me." The judge pounded the gavel to restore order, but Alejandro didn't stop. His eyes bore into Clara with a rage so intense it made her shudder. "You stole him from me," he roared, stepping forward. "You are not his mother. That boy is mine. I am his father." "Security!" the judge ordered loudly. The guards rushed toward Alejandro, but he brushed them aside with a swift movement, his gaze fixed solely on Clara. His steps were heavy, like a predator approaching its prey, and before anyone could react, he grabbed her arm with brutal strength. "This isn't over, Clara," he yelled, shaking her violently. "You can't take him from me." Clara screamed in pain, feeling the pressure of his hand intensify on her arm. Thomas stood frozen, his eyes filled with fear. "Let me go," Clara shouted, trying to break free. "Let me go." But Alejandro was out of control. The rage he had contained all this time had erupted, and now he seemed like a possessed man. He yanked her toward him, his hands clawing like talons. "If he's not mine, he'll be no one's," he roared, his eyes wild. "Alejandro, enough!" Camilla shouted from the bench, tears brimming in her eyes. "Please, stop!" The guards finally arrived and tried to separate him from Clara, but he resisted with a nearly savage strength. Clara felt pain shoot through her arm as Alejandro pushed her against the wall, his teeth clenched and his face flushed. "You," he groaned, his voice cracking with fury and desperation. "You ruined my life. You took my son from me." "No!" Thomas shouted suddenly, his voice resonating powerfully amidst the chaos. "Don't hurt her!" Thomas's words seemed to break the spell. Alejandro froze, staring at the boy who looked back at him with a pale, terrified face. The hate and rage faded from his expression, replaced by profound anguish. "Thomas," he murmured, his voice trembling. But it was too late. The guards finally managed to pull him away from Clara, restraining him with force. Alejandro struggled for a moment and then collapsed, his body shaken by heart-wrenching sobs. "No! You can't take him from me!" he cried as the guards held him. "He's my son! Please, let me stay with him!" The judge struck the gavel hard, his face a mask of disapproval. "Enough!" he roared. "Mr. Ramirez, you are under arrest for contempt and assault." The guards began to escort Alejandro away, who continued to scream and plead as tears of fury and despair streamed down his face. But his words faded into an empty echo as they removed him from the room. "Clara!" he shouted one last time, his eyes red with rage and pain. "This isn't over. But when the door closed behind him, silence settled in the room. Clara leaned against the wall, trembling from head to toe. Thomas rushed to her and hugged her tightly, sobbing against her chest. "Mom," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Are you okay?" Clara held him as tightly as she could, feeling the comforting warmth of her son's body. "Yes, darling," she said softly, stroking his hair. "Everything is okay now. Everything is okay." The judge watched them with a softer expression and nodded. "The court appreciates your bravery, Mrs. Martinez." He turned to Camila and Lucia, who were watching the scene with sadness. "Alejandro Ramirez's actions will not go unpunished, but now the most important thing is to ensure Thomas's well-being." Clara nodded slowly, feeling the weight of tension beginning to lift. It was over. Alejandro was out of her life, and finally, Thomas was safe. "Thank you, Your Honor," she murmured, not letting go of her son. As they left the courtroom, Clara knew the struggle hadn't been in vain. She had won custody of Thomas, but more importantly, she had won the freedom to love her son without fear, without threats. Because despite all the pain and suffering, they had triumphed. And Alejandro Ramirez, with all his power and wealth, could never separate them again. The trial was over, but their new life together was just beginning. The day after the trial felt strange for Clara and Thomas. It wasn't exactly joy that hung in the air, but a kind of tense and cautious calm. The storm had passed, but the aftermath still weighed heavily in the small home they shared. Clara woke up early that morning, unable to fall back asleep after everything that had happened. The scene from the previous day kept replaying in her mind. Alejandro's shouts, the force with which he had held her, the desperation in his eyes when he was led out of the room. The court had sentenced Alejandro, and now he was behind bars for assault and contempt, awaiting formal charges that could keep him there for a long time. But even with that small victory, Clara couldn't feel completely at peace. There was something in the way Alejandro had looked at her in those final moments, an uncontrollable fire of anger and desperation that made her wonder if it was truly all over. Thomas, for his part, had been unusually quiet since they returned home. Clara knew the violence and conflict from the previous day had left a deep impression on her son. After all, he had witnessed how his supposed biological father, a man he barely knew, lost control and attacked the only mother he had ever known. That image would not be easy to erase. So when Clara entered the living room and found him sitting on the sofa, legs crossed and eyes lost in the distance, she knew she needed to talk to him. Gently, she sat beside him and wrapped an arm around his shoulders, feeling how Thomas's small body relaxed a bit under her touch. "Good morning, little one," she murmured softly. Thomas looked up, his dark eyes filled with questions. "Mom," he began in a whisper. "Why was he so angry?" Clara sighed, knowing she needed to choose her words carefully. Alejandro had reacted in a way she hadn't even anticipated. He had lost control, and in his desperation, he had shown just how destructive he could be. "Alejandro," Clara paused, struggling to find the right way to explain. "He felt so hurt when he realized he wasn't going to have you in his life. It's not an excuse for what he did, but I suppose the fear of losing you made him react that way." Thomas frowned, clearly confused. "But it's not fair for him to hurt you." His words were firm, filled with the innocence of a child who didn't understand the complexities of adult emotions. "No one has the right to do that, Mom. Not even him." Clara nodded slowly, feeling a wave of pride and sadness as she listened to her son. Even at his young age, Thomas understood more than she had imagined. "You're right, sweetheart. No one has the right to hurt another person. But," Clara hesitated for a moment and then took a deep breath. "That doesn't mean he isn't suffering too. Sometimes people do bad things because they're afraid, or because they don't know how to express what they feel." Thomas fell silent, thinking. Then he looked up with an expression that mixed curiosity and sadness. "And what's going to happen to him now?" Clara felt her heart clench. What would happen to Alejandro? Would he spend years in prison? Or would he receive some kind of help to deal with his emotional issues? She didn't know. But what she did know was that despite everything, Thomas had the right to understand his past, his biological family. And that included the woman who had remained silent throughout this whole conflict. Camilla, Thomas's biological mother. "I'm not sure what will happen to him," Clara admitted gently. "But I know there's someone else we should consider." "Who?" Thomas asked, frowning. "Camilla," Clara replied, careful to measure each word. "She is your biological mother. I know you've never really had the chance to know her. Perhaps—" She paused and looked at Thomas with tenderness. "Perhaps it's time for you to get to know her a little better." Thomas seemed to consider the idea, but said nothing. Clara understood. This was a lot for a child. However, deep in her heart, she knew that meeting Camilla was something he needed. She needed it too. "I'm going to talk to her," Clara finally said, making the decision. "But you don't have to do anything you don't want to, okay? We'll do it at your pace." Thomas nodded slowly, still thoughtful. "Okay, Mom. But does she love me too?" Clara felt her heart break at hearing that question. "I'm sure she does," she whispered, hugging him tightly. "She just has her own way of showing it." Clara wasted no time. That very afternoon she headed to the Ramirez house, a mansion she had only seen from afar, which now seemed strangely empty without Alejandro's presence. Camilla opened the door slowly, her face drawn and her eyes red from tears. Upon seeing Clara, her first reaction was surprise, but quickly her expression changed to a mix of confusion and pain. "Clara," she murmured, "what are you doing here?" Clara swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision she had made resting on her shoulders. "We need to talk, Camilla." She held her gaze, trying to convey calm and understanding. "About Thomas." The name seemed to trigger a wave of emotions in Camilla. The woman closed her eyes, as if the mere sound of her son hurt her. "Is he okay?" she asked in a trembling voice. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about him since all this ended. I don't know what to say to him. I don't know how to face him after what happened with Alejandro." Clara nodded slowly. "He's fine, but he's confused. And I think it's time for you two to have the opportunity to get to know each other better." Camilla looked at her with wide eyes, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Really?" she whispered, a cautious hope in her voice. "Would you let me spend time with him?" "Yes," Clara said, feeling a strange peace in saying it. "I think it's important for him. And for you, too." Tears began to roll down Camilla's cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you. After everything we've been through, I didn't expect you to even consider this." Clara took a deep breath. "It's not for you, Camilla. It's for Thomas. He deserves to know the person who gave him life, and if that means I have to set aside my own feelings, I will." Camilla nodded, her face bathed in tears. "I'll do whatever it takes to earn his forgiveness," she said, her voice broken. "I know I can't recover lost time, but I want to be part of his life, even if it's just a little." Clara looked at her for a long moment and then extended her hand, her gaze determined. "Let's do it for Thomas then, one step at a time." Camilla took her hand and squeezed it tightly, as if holding onto a lifeline. "For Thomas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. It was a new beginning, full of uncertainties and challenges. But it was also an opportunity to heal, to build something new and true for Thomas, because in the end, all that mattered was his happiness. And Clara was willing to do whatever it took to ensure that Thomas could have a future filled with love, surrounded by those who truly cared for him. Camilla would have a chance to prove she could be more than just his biological mother, and Clara, for the first time, felt she could share her son's heart. Because in the end, love is not measured by blood, but by sacrifice and the desire to see someone truly happy. It was a new chapter. Not the end of the story, but the beginning of something much larger. Time had not passed in vain for Thomas and Clara. Now, Thomas was a 23-year-old young adult, a strong and determined man, able to face challenges with the calm and wisdom his mother had taught him. The life they shared had changed in many ways, but their bond remained as strong as ever. Clara, at 58, still radiated that warmth and strength that had guided him since childhood, and Thomas took every opportunity to spend time with her, even now that he lived in his own apartment in the city. The moments they shared were small treasures of their daily life. One afternoon a week, they met at Clara's small house to cook together, a tradition they had started when Thomas was just a curious teenager. Although their culinary skills weren't exceptional, for them, food had become a symbol of their relationship, a combination of effort, patience, and above all, love.
Yeah.
Do you remember when you tried to make me a cake for my birthday? Clara laughed as she chopped some vegetables on the counter. Thomas looked up from the pot where he was stirring a thick sauce and smiled. How could I forget? He replied with a chuckle. The oven caught fire and we almost burned down the house. Oh yes. Clara looked at him with bright, loving eyes. But I had never been prouder of you than that day. Thomas frowned with a smile. Really? It all ended in disaster. Clara put down the knife and turned to him, a tender expression on her face. Yes, but it wasn't about the outcome. It was because you never gave up, not even when everything was burning around you. She gave his chest a gentle tap. You've always been like that, Thomas. You never give up. And that's one of the things I love most about you. The young man felt a lump in his throat. Every day, every conversation with her reminded him how lucky he was. Clara hadn't just raised him. She had taught him to face life with dignity and courage, no matter how difficult things got. You taught me to be like this, he said softly. You taught me that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but moving forward even when you're terrified. Clara looked at him with tears in her eyes, yet kept smiling. And you taught me that love can transform anything, even a broken heart. They looked at each other in silence, sharing that moment with an intensity that needed no words. They had been through so much together, the pain of the trial, the fight for custody, the financial hardships, and finally, the healing they had built over time. But there was a part of their story that still lingered in the shadows, one that Thomas knew he needed to confront in order to move forward completely. Mom, he murmured, breaking the silence. There's something I need to do, something I've been thinking about for a while. Clara tilted her head in curiosity. What is it, son? Thomas sighed, feeling tension fill him, but he didn't look away from his mother's loving eyes. I'm going to see Alejandro. The words fell like a stone in the silence of the kitchen. I need to hear him out. I need to understand why he did everything he did. Clara stood still, watching him with a mix of concern and understanding. Are you sure about that? She asked gently. You don't have to do this, Thomas. You owe him nothing. I know, he nodded firmly. But this isn't about him. It's about me. I don't want to keep carrying this anger and resentment inside me. I want to hear his side. I want to understand, even if it doesn't mean forgiving him. Clara remained silent for a long moment and then nodded slowly. Okay, son. If you think it's the best thing for you, then I support you. Thomas hugged her tightly, feeling the warmth and security only she could give him. Thank you, Mum, he whispered against her shoulder. You're always the one who gives me the strength to keep going. Thomas sat across from his biological father in the small visiting room of the prison, the atmosphere cold and filled with tension. He had spent so much time imagining this moment, countless nights wishing to confront this man who had caused so much pain and confusion in his life. And yet, now that Alejandro was right in front of him, weaker and older than he had ever imagined, Thomas felt an unexpected pang of compassion. Alejandro watched him warily, as if unsure of what to say or do. For a long moment, neither spoke. Time seemed to stand still, and the metal room, with its flickering lights and stale air, became a space where the past and present faced each other head-on. "Why are you here?" Alejandro finally asked, his voice rough and shaky. He had lost much of his arrogance and pride. What remained was a defeated man, broken by his own mistakes. Thomas took a breath, trying to calm the furious beating of his heart. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Alejandro's. "I want to understand," he said slowly. "I want to know why you did what you did. I want to know why you abandoned me." The words fell like a hammer in the silence. Alejandro squeezed his eyes shut, his body tense as if he were battling an internal pain that consumed him. When he opened them again, there was a sadness so deep in his gaze that Thomas felt a knot form in his throat. "It wasn't how I saw it back then," Alejandro murmured, his voice broken. "It wasn't abandonment, Thomas. It never was." He leaned forward, trying to reach his son with his gaze, with words. "When you were born, all I felt was fear, a paralyzing fear." Thomas frowned, confused. "Fear? Of what?" "Of being your father," Alejandro confessed, tears shining in his eyes. "Of not being able to protect you, of being like my own father, who destroyed everything he touched. My father was a violent, cruel man, and he always told me that power was the only thing that mattered, that showing love was a sign of weakness." Thomas stayed silent, absorbing those words. He had never heard that part of the story. He had always seen Alejandro as a cold and calculating man, but now he saw the reflection of a scared child trapped in an adult's body, a child who had been shaped by pain and fear. "When Camila told me we were having you," Alejandro continued, his voice weighted with memories, "I felt something I had never felt before. Panic. I didn't know how to be a father. I didn't know how to love without destroying. I thought that if I let you get close, I would hurt you. I would ruin you just like my father ruined me. So I did the only thing I thought was right. I tried to keep you away. I wanted to protect you. From myself." Tears began to roll down Thomas's cheeks, silent yet unstoppable. The idea that his father had acted, not out of malice, but from a deep, desperate fear of repeating a cycle of violence and destruction, shook him to his core. Alejandro was not just the villain of his story. He was a broken man who had made terrible decisions, mistakenly believing he was doing what was best. "But then why did you try to get me back?" Thomas whispered, his voice almost inaudible. "Why did you try to destroy the life Clara and I had built?" Alejandro looked down, his body shaking with emotion. "Because when I saw you grow, when I realized you had found the love and care I could never give you," he took a deep breath, struggling to control his sobs. "I realized what I had lost. I realized that everything I did only pushed you further away. And then I thought that if I regained control, if I had you back, I could fix it. That somehow I could show you I wasn't the monster I always feared I'd be. But I didn't do it for you." He lifted his gaze, his eyes flooded with tears. "I did it for me. It was selfish. I was a coward." Alejandro's words sunk into Thomas's chest like knives. The sincerity, desperation, and pain in his father's voice were so profound that Thomas felt all the hatred and resentment he had accumulated over the years crumble away like a sandcastle. What he saw in front of him was not a villain, but a broken man, shackled by his own mistakes and demons. I always feared becoming like my father," Alejandro whispered. "But in the end I became someone worse. I became a man incapable of love, unable to give without destroying." His hands trembled on the table, handcuffed, powerless. "I should never have taken you from Clara. I should never have tried to control you. But everything I did was because I didn't know how to break the cycle." Thomas felt a heart-wrenching sob rise in his chest and let it out, tears streaming down his face. He had spent his entire life believing Alejandro hated him, that he had been just a pawn in his games of power. But hearing these words, hearing the genuine pain and regret in his voice, changed everything. Alejandro looked at him, his face contorted with anguish. "Thomas," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I don't even deserve for you to be here. But I just wanted you to know that if I could change something, if I could go back and do things right, I would. Because despite everything, I loved you. I loved you from the moment I knew you existed. I just didn't know how to show it." Thomas brought his hands to his face, trying to contain the sobs shaking his body. He didn't want to feel compassion for this man. He didn't want to forgive him. But the truth was that he could no longer see him as a villain. He only saw a man who had failed, who had destroyed his own life by not knowing how to confront his fear. "I'm sorry," murmured Alejandro, his voice hoarse and broken. "I'm sorry for not being the father you deserved. I'm sorry for ruining everything." Thomas looked up, his eyes red and his heart shattered. He had no words. He didn't know what to say. So he simply stood up from the chair, his body trembling, and turned away. Alejandro remained there, watching him leave, tears streaming down his face. "I love you, son," he whispered, knowing that Thomas couldn't hear him. Without looking back, Thomas exited the room, his face soaked with tears. He said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. But something had changed in his heart. The weight of anger, of resentment, had vanished, replaced by a deep sadness and painful understanding. The sound of the prison doors opening echoed in the yard. Alejandro lifted his gaze, surprised, as a guard approached him. "Ramirez," said the guard in a serious tone, "you have a visitor, and it seems today is your lucky day." Alejandro frowned, confused, but then he saw Thomas standing at the entrance, his face showing a serene resolve. "Thomas?" he whispered, incredulous. The young man said nothing. He just slowly approached, took some documents from his pocket, and extended them toward the guard. "These are the papers for his release," he said firmly. "I paid the bail. He's coming with me." Alejandro stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Thomas was getting him out of jail. "Why? Why are you doing this?" he asked in a hoarse voice, his eyes filled with astonishment and confusion. Thomas stared at him intently. "Because I want you to have the chance to prove you're not the monster you thought you were," he said softly. "Because we all deserve a second chance, even you." And with those words, Alejandro felt something break inside him. The tears welled up again, but this time they were not of pain, but of hope. Thomas had not forgiven him, but he was giving him the chance to redeem himself, and that, for Alejandro, was more than he ever expected. The path to redemption isn't easy, especially for someone who has spent a lifetime destroying what he loved. Alejandro knew that the choices he had made had condemned him to a life of solitude and pain, but now, for the first time, thanks to his son, he had the opportunity to do the right thing. Sitting in the passenger seat of Thomas's car, he silently watched the scenery pass by. Every kilometer they traveled brought him closer to a destination he had never imagined. Thomas drove with a calm expression, but his eyes reflected intense concentration. They hadn't talked much since leaving the prison. Alejandro hadn't asked questions, and Thomas hadn't offered answers. There was something unspoken in their silence, an understanding that before they could even think about a future, Alejandro needed to confront his past. After what he had told him in prison, something had changed in Thomas. He had started to see Alejandro not as an enemy, but as a defeated man, trapped by his own fears and regrets. He still didn't know if he could fully forgive him, but he felt that it was no longer enough to leave him locked away. If Alejandro wanted to earn his freedom for real, he had to amend his mistakes. "I want you to see someone," Thomas finally said, breaking the silence. Alejandro nodded slowly, his hands trembling in his lap. "Camila?" he asked softly. Thomas nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "Yes. She deserves to hear what you told me. She deserves an apology. Face to face." He paused, taking a deep breath. "And afterward, we'll go see Clara." Alejandro felt his stomach twist at the mention of his ex-wife and Clara. He had hurt both women in different but equally deep ways. He had manipulated, isolated, and controlled Camila, and Clara. Clara had tried to take away the son she had raised with so much love. The thought of facing them terrified him more than any prison sentence. But he knew it was necessary. If he wanted to honor the opportunity Thomas was giving him, if he wanted, even for a moment, to try to reclaim some humanity, he had to face that pain. So he simply nodded, accepting the challenge with his head bowed. They arrived at Camilla's house at sunset. The small front garden was well kept, with vibrant flowers contrasting against the grey clouds overhead. Camilla stood at the door when they arrived, arms crossed and brow furrowed. She had received Thomas's call, but seeing him arrive with Alejandro by his side seemed to leave her breathless. What is happening here?" she asked, looking at her son and then at her ex-husband, who dared not raise his gaze. Thomas stepped closer and looked at her with a mix of affection and determination. "I want him to talk to you, Mom, to tell you everything he told me. I think you both need this to heal." Camilla narrowed her eyes, clearly distrustful, but nodded. Then she directed her cold, hard gaze toward Alejandro. Talk about what, Alejandro?" Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and pain. "After everything you did, do you think a few words will change anything?" Alejandro swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his mistakes like a stone on his chest. He stepped forward, his hands visibly trembling. "No, Camila," he murmured, his voice broken. "I know words won't be enough. But what I want to say is that I regret everything. Everything I did. I regret controlling you. I regret pushing you away from your own son. I regret making you feel powerless." Tears filled his eyes as he spoke. "And most of all, I regret letting fear turn me into such a despicable man that I wouldn't let you be the mother you wanted to be." Camilla watched him, motionless, but her eyes reflected the internal struggle she was facing. Part of her wanted to scream, to throw him out of her house and her life forever. But another part, the part that still remembered the man with whom she had built a family, was listening, absorbing every word with painful attention. "I know I hurt you deeply," Alejandro continued, his voice barely a whisper. "And I can't undo it. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. I want you to know that if I could go back, I would do things differently." Camilla squeezed her eyes shut, letting out a choked sob. "Why now?" she asked desperately. "Why after all this time?" Alejandro looked at Thomas and then back at her. "Because Thomas gave me something I never believed I deserved. He gave me the chance to be honest, to face what I did, and I don't want to waste it." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Camilla. I just want you to know that I recognize all the pain I caused you, and I deeply regret every selfish decision I made." Camilla watched him for a long moment, her face wet with tears. Then she slowly nodded, as if processing what she had just heard. "I can't forgive you yet, Alejandro," she said, her voice broken. "But thank you for saying it. Thank you for not hiding from this." Alejandro let out a stuttered sigh, as if those few words were more than he had ever hoped for. Thomas watched the scene unfold, his heart filled with a mix of pain and relief. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start, a small step toward healing. "Let's go," he said softly, touching Alejandro's shoulder. "There's still someone else you need to see." Clara's house was as cozy as ever, Upon seeing Thomas enter, she smiled, but when Alejandro appeared behind him, her expression turned serious. There was no hatred in her gaze, but deep sadness. She stood in the doorway, watching him as if she couldn't believe this man was there. "Clara," began Alejandro, his voice heavy with emotion. "I don't even know how to start. What I did, what I tried to do to you, is unforgivable." Clara crossed her arms, looking at him with her head slightly tilted. "And what is it you want to say to me, Alejandro?" she asked firmly. "What do you hope to achieve with this?" Alejandro stepped forward, his gaze locked on her. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to accept me. But I want you to know that I regret underestimating you. I regret not seeing the incredible human being you are. You were everything Thomas needed, and more. You were the mother I could never be." His words broke at the end, and tears began to fall down his face. "And I just want to thank you, because thanks to you, Thomas is the wonderful person he is today." The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to fill every corner of the house. Clara studied him carefully, then looked at Thomas. Her son gazed at her with a mixture of pleading and hope. He wanted her to do this, not for Alejandro, but for him. Finally, Clara took a deep breath and nodded. "I accept your apology, Alejandro." She paused, her eyes fixed on his. "But not for you. I accept it because my son needs to close this chapter, because we deserve to leave this behind and move forward." Alejandro sobbed, covering his face with his hands. "Thank you," he whispered, feeling something inside him release, as if a chain that had imprisoned him his whole life had finally broken. Thomas watched his biological parents and the woman who had been his true mother. Tears flowed freely down his face, but this time they were of relief. Finally, the cycle had closed. Finally, every piece had fallen into place. And with that final act, Thomas knew he had found the peace he had long sought. It was time to start anew, together. The sunset painted the sky with golden and orange hues as Thomas stood alone on the small hill behind Clara's house, the place he had come to think so many times as a child. From there, he could see the house that had been his home, the place that had offered him safety and love amidst the storm of his childhood. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the trees, and Thomas closed his eyes, letting the fresh air clear his thoughts. Weeks had passed since the meetings with Camilla and Clara. Alejandro, his biological father, now lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, trying to rebuild his life step by step. The apologies hadn't erased the pain or healed all the wounds, but they had marked the beginning of something new. A beginning Thomas had never imagined possible. Over time, the hatred and resentment he had carried for so many years began to fade. Sitting on that hill, Thomas realized something he had taken a while to understand. Forgiveness hadn't been for Alejandro. It hadn't freed him, nor erased his mistakes. It had been for himself. He had forgiven to heal, to let go of a weight that had shackled him to a painful past for too long. Thomas took a deep breath, allowing the air to fill his lungs. He thought of all the people who had been part of his story: Clara, Camila, and yes, even Alejandro. Each of them had taught him something valuable about love, sacrifice, and forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about approving what someone else did, he thought, as he watched the sky change color. It's about freeing yourself from the power that pain has over you. He had clung to anger for so long, believing that if he forgave, he somehow minimized what Alejandro had done to him, that if he let it go, he would be allowing evil to triumph. But that wasn't true. Forgiveness didn't mean the pain ceased to exist or that his father's actions were justified. It meant that he, Thomas, was no longer willing to let the past define his present. Forgiveness is like removing an invisible chain that binds you to a broken version of yourself. For a long time, he had felt he needed to confront Alejandro to win. But the true victory hadn't been confronting him in prison. It had been having the courage to listen to him, to see the pain and humanity behind his actions. There were no excuses for what his father had done, but at some point Thomas realized he didn't need vengeance. He needed peace. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, he whispered to himself softly. It means remembering without the pain. He looked at the horizon, where the sun was slowly sinking, filling the sky with a gentle glow. He recalled Clara's words, his true mother, during one of those nights when she sat by his bed to comfort him. Forgiveness, Thomas, is a gift you give to yourself. You don't do it for the other person. You do it to free yourself, to move forward without letting the pain consume you. In that moment, Thomas understood the true value of those words. He had been a child full of questions and doubts, seeking answers that only time and love could give him. He had grown up with the confusion of two families that always seemed to be at war over him. But now he saw that the most important battle was not between them. The battle had always been in his own heart. Forgiveness, he reflected, is the courage to let go of the past, to make room for the future. He thought of his father, of that broken man who had been too afraid to love, and felt something new. Compassion. Not the pity one feels for someone weak, but the kind that arises from seeing someone struggle to be better, even when they were never taught how. Alejandro had been a victim of his own hatred and fear. It didn't justify him, but it allowed him to understand. And understanding it freed him from the last remnants of resentment that still lingered. He slowly stood up from the hill and looked toward Clara's house, which was beginning to light up with evening lights. The home where he had learned to love and be loved. The place where he had grown. It had witnessed much pain, but also much love. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered to the wind, smiling, "for teaching me to forgive." And then he thought of Camilla, of her own struggle to be the mother she could never be. She had spent years feeling inadequate, trying to earn the right to be in his life. And yet she too had changed. She had grown. She had found her own way to heal. "Thank you, Mum," he repeated softly, thinking of her. And finally, he thought of Alejandro. Even with all his faults, with all his mistakes, Alejandro had tried to redeem himself. He had taken the opportunity to rebuild their relationship, not as father and son, but as two men who shared a painful and difficult past. Thomas smiled, feeling the peace finally settle in his heart. "I forgive you, Dad." The wind seemed to carry those words into the sky, and with them, Thomas felt the cycle closing completely. It didn't matter how much pain was in his past because he had turned it into strength. He had found peace not in revenge or in forgetfulness, but in understanding and in the courage to let go. Forgiveness, after all, wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new one. With a light heart and a clear mind, Thomas descended the hill, and with each step, he felt a new path opening up, full of possibilities, love, and true freedom. Finally, he was at peace. Finally, he was free. That's all for today. If you enjoyed the story, please leave your like and let me know what impacted you the most. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more inspiring content every week. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.